The story began with a man bleeding heavily, each breath shallow and ragged. He thought about how far they had come, how much they had endured. All around him, laser beams poured down like deadly rain. He clung to a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could still defeat the enemy. But in an instant, something tore into his chest. He froze, eyes wide. It took him a moment to realize there was a gaping hole where his heart had been beating seconds before. His knees buckled, and he fell. That was when the truth struck him. It was a fatal blow. He crumpled forward, face pressed into the dirt. One last thought flickered in his mind. That he was about to die without ever making a difference. Through blurred vision, he fixed his gaze on the flying humanoid shape ahead. The Liquidator, mankind's most feared adversary. This being had appeared without warning one day and annihilated an entire continent. In its wake, humanity had formed a special force to repel such monsters. The first to join had been a man who famously survived a meteor strike without so much as a scratch, armed with nothing but a shield. People called him Brian Miller, the world's protecting shield. Another was a sage whose power was said to rival an entire military division, Bella Albright, the great sage. Then there was Jacob Bloomfield, the divine archer, who once felled a high-level dragon with a single arrow. And Amy White, the sword saint, hailed as the strongest swordsman in history. And then there was them, the support unit. Around them lay the corpses of fallen comrades. The man bleeding out on the ground, Gray Lee, was a mere foot soldier who believed they were little more than sacrificial pawns. He watched the elites fight, their skills on a level he could hardly comprehend. He had known that graduates of the World Union Academy were exceptional, but the gap was far wider than he imagined. The elites launched attack after attack against the Liquidator. The sight made him feel useless. He thought that whether the support unit existed or not, the outcome would be the same. Amy continued her assault, stabbing with blinding speed. Gray gritted his teeth. The disparity between them was so crushing it made his chest ache more than his wounds. The Liquidator evaded her with ease, until one of her blades drew blood. He found himself impressed that she had managed even that, but then the Liquidator grew serious. With one swift, precise strike, he sliced Amy's body clean in half. Her blood splattered across the ground as she fell. Gray's eyes widened in horror. The Liquidator had stopped playing games. Gray could not believe it. A single strike had ended her. The realization hit him hard. There was no chance of victory. He lay in a spreading pool of his own blood, still conscious. Time had passed since the wound to his heart, yet he lived. He could not understand why. Then, through the ringing in his ears, a weak voice reached him. The voice said that it had finally found him. His blood dripped to the ground, each drop transforming into a small point of light, which grew into a message, summoning him, declaring that he possessed great power. He awoke to find himself in a dark place, surrounded by ancient stone structures. He asked aloud where he was. The barren emptiness made him think of the afterlife. Ahead, upon a throne, sat a figure like a god, clad in black, with horns, a veil across its brow, and a golden mark on its chest. Its face was calm, stoic. The figure told him that he had not died, and that his wounds had already been healed. Gray's thoughts raced. He saw an image of his battered body projected before him and asked if it had been healed by the figure. The figure replied that it had not, it was Gray's own power. Gray was bewildered. The figure admitted that it could not fully understand his power, but assured him it was greater than the Liquidator's, provided he could master it. Gray asked if that meant they could win. The figure said it did not know and advised against false hope, but insisted that the Liquidator must be destroyed. That was why it rose from the throne and drove a hand into Gray's chest. A bright blue light flared, and a magic circle formed over his heart. The voice declared that it would lend him its strength. Gray awoke on his own bloodied body, gasping. He reached for his sword, the tip wreathed in dark energy. The voice told him that it was his own power. The mysterious creature explained that Gray's power was not something visible to the naked eye. Gray accepted this with a silent nod, the weight of the words settling over him. At that moment, the Liquidator's gaze shifted. He had noticed Gray. Without hesitation, Gray lunged forward and slashed. The Liquidator caught sight of his face, stunned that such strength still remained among the living. A deep scratch appeared across his chest. Gray realized his blow had connected. He attacked again, emboldened by the proof that his power could harm the monster. The Liquidator warned him not to underestimate him. Then, in a blur, Gray's world twisted. He struggled to process what had happened, until the realization struck. His body had been cleaved in half, blood spraying from the ruin like a fountain. The Liquidator, strangely calm, commended him for forcing him to fight at full strength. Darkness then swept across the battlefield, a black mist swallowing the air. From it emerged a hooded figure with a mask, his very form flickering like living black flame. In his hands, he carried an enormous black sword. The Liquidator, wary, erected a barrier around himself. But the flame on the figure's left side burned away, revealing a familiar face, Gray's. The Liquidator questioned if he was truly human. Gray's glare was the only answer before he brought his sword down upon the barrier, straining to shatter it. The Liquidator's eyes narrowed as cracks spread through the shield. It splintered, and Gray's blade cut deep. Once more, the Liquidator demanded to know if he was truly human. Gray replied that he wondered the same about himself. They clashed again. Gray admitted to himself that the Liquidator's strength was no small thing. The monster, breathing heavier now, seemed unsettled by Gray's survival. It leaned close, whispering a promise to crush him over and over until he stayed dead. But Gray moved first, his strike spilling yellow blood. The Liquidator called him a monster, but his tone carried no defeat. Light flared around his body as he gathered power, forming a magic circle between his clasped hands. He announced that Gray's time was up. Gray gripped his massive sword, waiting for the next move. Night fell in an instant. He darted behind the Liquidator, aiming for the neck, but his blade was stopped cold by another barrier. The Liquidator declared that within the plane of true dusk, nothing could harm him. He told Gray to cease his futile struggle and to look at the stars. Gray's eyes widened as the reflection of a bright star filled them. It swelled, its glow blinding, until it plummeted from the heavens like a burning sun. The impact was cataclysmic, carving a vast crater into the earth. Gray was nowhere to be seen. The Liquidator assumed that pulverizing him to dust would end it, but then a portal formed, expanding into a massive magic circle. A voice spoke, acknowledging the immense power gathered. The voice concluded that it was enough to bring someone back. The Liquidator recognized the voice. It was Chronos. Chronos addressed the wielder of great power, asking if he could hear him. Since Gray had spent every ounce of his strength, Chronos declared he would send him back to the past. The Liquidator cursed his name. Chronos told Gray that this was all he could do for him. A great clock appeared, ticking backward. As the final second passed, Chronos said he would entrust the world's fate to him. Gray awoke lying in soft grass, confused. The sky was bright, the air warm. To his right lay his hometown, Renato Village, though it had been destroyed 15 years ago. He recalled Chronos's words about sending him to the past. It was impossible to believe, yet the proof stood before him. He pushed himself up, noticing a familiar injury on his body. In those days, he was often tormented by Belder and his gang. This time, he promised himself he wouldn't be beaten by the likes of them, though he knew he was too weak to match them yet. Sighing, he admitted that defeating the Liquidator still felt like an impossible dream. He resolved to avoid trouble until he grew stronger, but while walking through the forest, fate put him face to face with Belder, the largest and most arrogant of his bullies, accompanied by 3 others. Belder said he had been searching for Gray and that it had been a hassle finding him. Gray tensed. Belder tossed a sword at his feet and told him to pick it up. When Gray hesitated, Belder accused him of playing dumb, announcing he wanted a mock battle. Gray declined, saying his injury had not yet healed and thanking him for the offer. Belder insisted the blade was blunt and harmless. Gray countered that even a blunt sword was still iron, and iron could maim. Belder's expression darkened. He barked at Gray to shut his mouth, declaring that he had no right to refuse. If he didn't want a sword, then he could fight barehanded instead. Belder lunged forward without hesitation, catching Gray off guard. Gray couldn't believe the brute intended to beat him even when he stood unarmed. This didn't feel like a mock battle at all. It reeked of genuine malice. A memory from before his return surfaced. He recalled the military doctor explaining that his swordsmanship had stalled because of an injury he'd suffered as a child. Looking back, Gray realized that was the moment his life as a loser had begun. He sidestepped, evading Belder's first strike. The ease of the movement confused him. Belder clicked his tongue in frustration and attacked again. Gray ducked under the swing, his body moving on instinct. The two of them fell into a rhythm, a vicious dance where Belder attacked and Gray slipped away with each blow. It wasn't that Belder was slow, Gray realized, it was that he himself had grown faster. The revelation dawned on him as Belder's blade passed within an inch of his face. He closed the gap between them, startling the onlookers. The other three young men muttered that it seemed like Gray had become an entirely different person. He stooped to pick up the sword. His body might not be the one hardened by endless battle, but his mind held every memory of those fights. Belder came at him again. Gray swung with his uninjured hand, striking true. Belder let out a sharp groan, stumbling back. Gray was surprised it was enough to knock him off his feet. For a moment, he wondered if it was right to fight someone so inexperienced. But pity was wasted on trash like this, men who had tormented him simply because he couldn't fight back. That was no longer the case. His next attack forced Belder to drop his weapon entirely. Cursing, Belder staggered back. Gray noted how easily he'd surrendered the sword. This was worse than amateur skill. He remarked that Belder clearly had no training in receiving a blow. Stepping closer, Gray told him there was nothing to fear, since the blade was dull and perfectly safe to beat someone with. Then he struck. Belder's eyes went wide as blood welled from his shoulder. Shocked, he cried out and fell to his knees. Gray examined the weapon. It was blunt, completely harmless in theory. If it had been sharp, Belder might have been dead. Without mercy, Gray continued the assault. A strike to the nose sent Belder sprawling on his back, blood gushing. Gray decided to keep using the blunt edge. Looming over him, he mocked his screams, reminding him that he had been the one to claim such a weapon was safe. His grin twisted into something dangerous. Fear crept into Belder's eyes. He shouted for his companions to stop standing around and attack. But they hesitated, unnerved by Gray's sudden strength. One suggested they attack from behind. They surrounded him. Gray asked if they wanted another round. Belder barked in order to kill him. Gray admitted he had been willing to overlook the earlier attack, but had now changed his mind. The forest soon erupted with the sounds of violence. When it was over, all four bullies were bruised, sporting swollen lumps on their heads, their eyes barely able to open. They knelt meekly, hands resting in their laps. Gray recalled how these same faces had once filled him with fear. He asked if they were from a dojo. Belder replied vaguely that it was something like that. Another admitted they had stopped going, thinking themselves strong enough. Gray scoffed inwardly at their definition of strength. Still, he saw potential value in the dojo. It was referral only, and he wanted in. Belder refused, saying he couldn't bear to tell his master he'd lost. Gray swung his sword in front of Belder's face, suggesting they continue what they'd started. Panic set in. Belder bolted, shouting the dojo's location over his shoulder. His speed startled everyone. The three lackeys shouted after him not to leave them behind. They entered the city. Belder asked why Gray wanted the dojo. Gray explained that it had a recommendation slot for the academy. Belder said he had heard of that. Gray stated plainly that this was his goal. One lackey remarked that Gray was already strong enough. Gray replied that even the world's strongest fighters couldn't match the Liquidator. Even with Chronos' power, he hadn't scratched the monster when it was serious. He had no idea how strong he needed to be, but he had an idea where to start. He remembered the fleeting moment during his clash with the Liquidator when he'd controlled the dark power, channeling swordsmanship taught by the Sword Saint. If he had trained in the same conditions she had, the fight's outcome might have been different. That, he suspected, was why Chronos had sent him here. They arrived at the dojo, where a woman emerged, her sharp gaze scanning them. She asked if her students had tried to use her swordsmanship to bully a civilian, only to be beaten soundly. Her tongue clicked in disapproval. This was Saria, the dojo's instructor. Belder stammered that it had only been a mock battle. Saria's answer was a brutal strike that sent him crashing into a wall with a deafening thud. The three others froze, eyes wide. She accused him of lying, declaring that if beating an unarmed man was a mock battle, then what she had just done counted as one too. Pointing her sword at his face, she ordered him to leave and never return, stripping him of the right to call himself her student. They all muttered agreement and fled, Saria sat before Gray, apologizing for the trouble her former students had caused him. Gray replied that there was no need for her to worry about what had happened. Saria thanked him for his understanding, then shifted the conversation to the matter he had come for, a recommendation to the academy. She said she wished to apologize again for the trouble caused by Belder and his companions, but as much as she might want to write a letter in his favor, she first needed to see his abilities for herself. She handed him a wooden sword. Gray took it without hesitation. She told him he could make the first move and invited him to attack whenever he was ready. Gray advanced, striking at her without hesitation. The other students in the dojo watched closely, evaluating his movements. Saria noted that his swordsmanship was surprisingly practical for someone his age. There was an unmistakable weight behind his blows, as if he had endured countless battles. When she attacked, he met her strike and deflected it cleanly. In that moment, she understood that Belder and the others could never have matched him. She observed that his style was largely self-taught, though every so often a strike or stance carried the polish of academy training. It made her wonder if someone had once instructed him. His swordplay was rough, yet there was clear talent. He was, she thought, a diamond in the rough. When it seemed time to conclude the match, she struck at him. He moved to counter. Their blades met in sharp, echoing clashes. She attacked again, but to her surprise, Gray's pace never faltered. He matched her step for step. She had intended only to test his skill, but now she felt her best being drawn out against him. An unfamiliar sensation crept in as they fought. She realized it was fear. Then he swung with such force that she was forced back a step. She told herself it was nothing more than a wild swing, but in that instant, she also saw his weakness. Seizing the moment, she went for the final blow. But her strike never landed. She froze, staring at the severed remains of her sword. Gray, equally stunned, looked at the broken weapon. The sensation running through him was the same he had felt in battle against the Liquidator. Proof that he still held that strange power, but it came at a cost. Pain surged through his body, driving him to his knees. Saria asked urgently what was wrong. He realized the truth. His body simply could not keep up with the power. His legs trembled, but he forced himself upright and told her he was fine. Inside, he resolved never to use that strength recklessly again. For a moment, he considered explaining it to her, but seeing her puzzled expression, he decided against it. Even if he told her, she likely would not believe him. Instead, he excused it as getting carried away. Saria, however, knew it was impossible to cut her weapon with a dull wooden sword. She could see that he knew it too. She asked what was troubling him. When he gave no real answer, she let the matter drop and returned to the topic of the recommendation. He confirmed he had heard she could provide one. She admitted she could indeed recommend him to the Royal Academy of Swordsmanship, the kingdom's finest institution. However, she told him bluntly that she would not recommend he go there. She did not think he belonged in that place. The words stung. They fed into his insecurity, the same doubt that had haunted him since the battle. His belief that he lacked true strength. Saria continued, telling him there was another place he should aim for. The World Union Academy. Gray's eyes widened. She explained that he should not settle for being the kingdom's best. He belonged among the world's top warriors. The thought stunned him. That was the place where the Sword Saint and the others had trained. He asked if someone like him could truly be accepted there. She answered simply that it was impossible. She knew, and so did he, that his body was far from fit enough to wield a sword at that level. She pointed out that with his current state, he might pass for a skilled swordsman at the Royal Academy, but the World Union Academy demanded more. Every student there was a genuine monster. He knew she was right. His current body could not compete. His expression darkened. Saria asked why he was giving up so easily. She reminded him that there were still 9 months until the entrance exam. He countered that 9 months was not much time. She admitted it might not be enough but told him to trust her. Then she asked if he was ready to suffer for the next 9 months. He answered that he did not want to suffer, but he would do it anyway. He placed his trust in her. She liked his answer. Her demeanor shifted, her lips curling into a devilish grin. She announced that his hell was about to begin. Days blurred into weeks as Gray underwent relentless training under her guidance. His meals ranged from delicious to questionable. He sparred constantly, refining his swordsmanship, his determination fixed on passing the exam. 8 months later, his transformation was visible, muscles hardened, movements sharper. Saria declared she had nothing more to teach him and told him to face the exam with confidence. He was confused. There was still a month left. She explained that adjusting to an unfamiliar environment was difficult, so it was best for him to arrive early. She gave him money for travel and a month's food. He hesitated, suspecting she was trying to send him away. She told him he was overthinking it. He then mentioned rumors of an ogre's nest nearby. That caught her off guard. He added that there were few guards left in the village. She brushed it off, saying it had nothing to do with them and that aid from the royal capital would arrive soon. She urged him to leave for the exam without worry. He could tell she was lying. He knew the truth. No help would come, and before the village's destruction, she would die. In his past life, news had spread that she had been killed confronting the ogre alone. But all he said was that he understood her wishes. He thanked her and said he would be going. She smirked and wished him luck at the exam. Later that night, the forest carried an air of dread. Skeletal remains hung grotesquely from a tree, their jaws forced open by wooden spikes. Saria arrived, following the path described in the scout's report. The trail of blood she tracked wound deep into the woods until it ended at a grim, shadowed den. She was about to step inside when a voice asked where she thought she was going. Looking up, she saw Gray perched casually on a tree branch, smiling faintly and calling her, "Master." Surprise flickered in her eyes. She asked why he was here when he was supposed to be on his way to the academy. He countered by asking why she was here after claiming earlier that the ogre nest would be dealt with by the royal army. She explained that the army could not come due to an emergency, so she had decided to handle the matter herself. She told him not to worry, assuring him she had assessed the situation. The nest's leader was an elite ogre, and the colony numbered 40 to 50 in total. The minions, she admitted, would be the only difficulty. Gray knew better. An ogre's real strength lay in its intelligence and leadership. Being surrounded meant death, and he had already seen this particular future, his master's death and the village's destruction. He told her he wanted to go with her. She refused, insisting she could handle it alone. He tried to persuade her, saying he wanted the chance to gain real combat experience, then asked if she thought he would get in her way. That made her laugh, as she knew she could no longer beat him in a mock battle. Still, she warned that no one could predict what might happen in a real fight against a newly formed nest, and that it was better for him to wait until he had more real-world experience. When she refused to budge, he offered another idea, one that made her pause. He said he would fight her right there, knock her out, and deal with the ogre himself. His stance left no doubt he meant it. Eventually, she gave in, but on one condition. No matter what happened, he must come back alive. He agreed and told her to do the same. Beneath the cold moonlight, they crouched behind a boulder, watching the colony. The nest was built in a place with no escape routes. A sign of the ogre's confidence. It also meant that once they went in, retreat would be nearly impossible. Saria scanned the camp but saw no sign of the boss, guessing it was inside the largest tent. They would have to thin the numbers before it emerged. She told Gray to take one flank while she handled the other. He nodded, and they struck. One ogre barely had time to register their presence before Saria was upon it, her blade removing its head in a single stroke. The head hit the ground, and another ogre immediately raised the alarm. Within moments, a horde came rushing. On his side, Gray moved with ruthless precision, cutting down enemy after enemy. Saria was equally efficient. Soon, the ground was littered with corpses, and they regrouped in the center of the carnage. She praised his performance, remarking on how unbelievable it was for a first battle. He dismissed the compliment, telling her to stay alert, they were only getting started. But inside, he felt something was wrong. These ogres were far too weak. If this was truly their strength, Saria could have handled them alone. The real danger was still in that tent. Then he saw them. A pair of glowing red eyes in the darkness, fixed on him. An uneasy chill gripped his chest. Without hesitation, he told her they had to leave immediately. She asked why, but his expression turned urgent, and he shouted for her to run. She read the fear in his voice and complied. They sprinted for the exit, only for a massive figure to drop from above, blocking their escape. It was an elite ogre. Saria smirked, saying it was an honor that the boss had come to meet them. But Gray told her this wasn't the boss. A deafening roar tore through the air, forcing Saria to clap her hands over her ears. Dozens more ogres burst into the clearing, eyes wild. Behind them stood a towering, monstrous figure. Gray said it was far beyond an elite, an ogre general, the true master of the nest. The elite blocked the rear, the horde blocked the front, and the general loomed over all of them without even moving. Its presence alone was suffocating. The moment Saria heard the name, she knew the fight was unwinnable. She glanced toward the elite and suggested they cut it down to make an escape. She lunged, striking its shoulder, but the wound closed almost instantly. Gray told her it was pointless. The roar had empowered every ogre present, making them stronger and giving them rapid regeneration. Even she was now struggling to bring one down. He told her not to focus on winning, just to buy him time. Concern edged her voice as she asked what he intended to do. He answered with a single plan. Kill the ogre general. An axe-wielding ogre swung at him, trying to knock his weapon away. He grew irritated as more of them closed in from all sides. One well-placed blow shattered his sword entirely. He understood then. His weapon could not withstand the power of a boosted ogre. The ogre swung at him again, and Gray leapt back just in time. Relief flickered for a moment. He still had a spare sword, but he knew it would not last long either. Seeing his situation, Saria tossed her extra weapon toward him. He caught it and thanked her. Now armed with two blades, he focused on a single goal. Cut through the horde and reach the ogre general. The rest could wait. Drawing the second sword, he slashed through the ogres in his path in a blur of movement. One clawed at his cheek, leaving a thin scratch as it swung. Another came at him with an axe, the impact jarring his arms as he blocked. He clicked his tongue, forcing both swords forward to push it back. More ogres surged toward him. Above the din, the ogre general's weapon began to glow, followed by a roar so loud it rattled the ground. Gray flinched as the horde seemed to swell with power, their movements faster, their blows heavier. He understood instantly. The general had figured out his plan. It was smart. Too smart. Their weapons clashed again, his blade ringing against an axe, the force pushing him backward. Gritting his teeth, he kept moving forward, hacking through as many as he could. But then an ogre barreled into him, pinning him down while another raised its axe. He wrenched one arm free and drove his blade into the clinging ogre's neck. In that moment, he realized their intent. They were throwing themselves at him just to wear his weapons down. A shadow loomed overhead. Another ogre leapt, fist cocked. He brought up his sword in defense, but the impact was monstrous, hurling him across the ground. His chest burned, blood filling his mouth. His hands shook as he rose to one knee, breath ragged. One sword lay in pieces beside him. He was down to his last. The truth sank in. With only one blade, facing the horde and the general was impossible. Experience from before his regression told him as much. He called out to Saria, telling her to run while they were still focused on him. She only looked amused. When he pressed, asking if she planned to die for nothing, she replied with a grim expression. Then her tone shifted. She admitted she could not run at all. His eyes dropped to her leg. A deep gash bled heavily. His stomach turned cold. Now there were no options left. He had come back in time with one purpose, to defeat the Liquidators, but this fight might be where his life ended. He swung his sword with everything he had, but the steel finally gave way under the strain, shattering into fragments. Still, he refused to stop. He forced himself to remember the sensation of that power he had touched before, the one that could cut down impossible foes. He closed his eyes, teeth clenched, forcing the memory into his mind as the ogres closed in. The moment the final shard of his sword spun through the air, his eyes snapped open, glowing red. The feeling returned. In his hands formed a blade of pure shadow, its edge dripping with lethal intent. With a single swing, he cleaved through a cluster of ogres, severing heads in a spray of blood. Mist curled along his blade and face. Saria stared in confusion. Gray's expression was grim, yet he turned to her and assured her it was all right. The ogre general's weapon glowed again, only to be sliced apart in an instant. While Saria's attention was fixed on that, another ogre lunged for her. She cut it down with surprising ease, realizing the truth. Without the general's boost, their blows were nothing. The battle dragged on into the late hours of the night. When the last corpse hit the ground, Gray apologized for breaking her sword. She waved it off, saying he had saved her life. He offered the broken weapon back to her, but before she could ask about the strange power, his legs buckled. He collapsed face first into the dirt. Panic broke through her composure as she shouted his name. Gray's mind sank into darkness. All around him was black, except for a single door bound in chains. Black flames began to eat through the bindings. He recognized the sensation. It was the same power he had just unleashed. The thought of opening it made him uneasy, yet he stepped forward. Then, a presence appeared behind him, so heavy and terrifying it froze him in place. His breathing grew quick and shallow. He knew without question, if he opened that door now, he would die. A voice spoke from the darkness, telling him he had made the right choice. He jolted awake, gasping, drenched in sweat. Saria, startled, turned toward him. Relief softened her face as she told him he was finally awake. When he asked where he was, she explained he was in the village infirmary. He had been unconscious for 5 days, and she admitted quietly that she had been afraid he might never wake. When Gray realized he had been unconscious for 5 days, the truth sank in. He had pushed his body far beyond its limits. Saria remarked that calling it pushing himself was putting it lightly, but she set the comment aside and asked if he could move. Gray tried, only to discover that his right arm felt useless. He could move it with effort, but there was no strength behind the motion. A pit formed in his stomach at the thought of never holding a sword again. Worse still, an odd bruise marred the skin. A blotch as though black ink had been splattered along his arm. Saria seemed unsurprised. She told him she had expected his movement would be poor. He wondered silently if she could even see the black mark. Then he admitted aloud that his dominant arm was all but powerless. She confirmed his fear. He would not be healing properly anytime soon. The bones in his arm had been completely shattered. Shock hit him. There was no pain, which only unsettled him further. Saria explained that they had used a magic potion for treatment. That made his eyes widen. Such things were expensive beyond reason. She told him not to worry about it. The village chief had provided the potion himself. Gray could not fathom why someone would give such a priceless resource to him. Saria reminded him plainly. He was the village's hero. He was still trying to process that when the door burst open and the chief entered. Gray immediately thanked him for the potion, but the chief insisted the thanks should go the other way. The man spoke with strong emotion, telling Gray that he had fought and slain an ogre general, a creature so dangerous that even troops from multiple towns could not so much as wound it, and that monster had been headed straight for their village. Clasping Gray's hand tightly, the chief said that without him and Saria, there would be no potion, no infirmary, no survivors. None of them would even be alive to speak now. Gray tried to brush it off, but the chief swore it was no exaggeration. The truth gnawed at Gray. Before his regression, the village had been wiped out by the ogre attack. Now, it still stood. The chief offered to explain everything in detail if Gray still did not understand the importance of what he had done. Then he added that he had heard Gray was planning to take the academy entrance exam, and asked if it was true. That single question snapped Gray into a flurry of thoughts. The exam was only a week after the battle. 5 of those days had been spent unconscious, leaving him just 2 days until it began. The trip to the academy was a 3-day walk. His face drained of color. On horseback, it would take a single day, but he had no money for that. He quickly asked the chief if he could borrow one. The chief, already anticipating this, said the best horse in the village had been prepared for him. Saria joked that if he had not woken up today, they would have tied him to the saddle and sent him there asleep. She opened the door, letting sunlight spill in. Outside, the horse waited, surrounded by a crowd holding banners, shouting thanks and wishing him luck. Villagers stepped forward to thank him personally. One man offered a pouch. When Gray asked what it was, the man explained it was money the entire village had gathered together after hearing how expensive applying to the World Union Academy could be. The gesture struck him deeply. He smiled, thanked them, and remarked that failing the exam would make it hard to face them again. Saria told him not to worry. He was the only candidate who had slain an ogre general. Still, his gaze drifted to his right arm. She reminded him his left still worked fine, and that was more than enough. She also told him not to rely on that strange power. He pointed out that passing with only one arm wouldn't be easy. She countered that his ability would be obvious to the examiners regardless. Her certainty left him with no choice but to believe her. He thanked her, saying that after hearing it put that way, he would have to pass. The village had survived. The world was no longer the same as it had been before his regression, and that meant the future could be changed, through his power. With that, he set off. The horse carried him swiftly, and he arrived just in time. He even patted the animal's neck, thanking it for the effort. Ahead lay a city encircled by a great lake, the World Union Academy. Inside the central arena, the host announced the start of exam ticket distribution. Until the process was complete, all examinees were to remain there. The crowd was large, but only 20 would pass. Some years, 50 were chosen. Other years, only 1. The host introduced Professor Ariel, who strode in and began distributing tickets immediately. She instructed them to take the paper that appeared before them. With a snap of her fingers, golden light filled the air, and a sheet of paper materialized before each candidate. Gray saw his own. Examinee number 513, fencing course. Ariel explained they would see only their number and assigned course, assuring them this was how it was done every year. She smiled faintly, stating that the academy judged neither age, gender, nationality, nor status, not even names. Only those who passed the exam and earned the right to cross the bridge would be asked for their name, and even then, they could give a false one if they wished. Gray frowned in confusion. He had left his sword at the inn, yet his paper still listed him for fencing. Ariel explained that course assignment was based on appearance. If she had gotten anyone's wrong, they were to raise their hand. The examinees stood in stunned silence, still processing what they had just witnessed. Many whispered among themselves, unable to believe that Professor Ariel had been able to assign courses for hundreds of people simply by looking at them. Some suspected she had researched every candidate beforehand. Others speculated that she must have used some kind of mind-reading magic. But after a few moments, no one raised their hand to dispute their placement. Ariel concluded, with a small nod, that no one had been misassigned. She then announced the exam schedules and instructed everyone to check their tickets. Gray looked down and saw that his was set for the first day. At 11 a.m. the sight made his stomach sink. He had been hoping for at least a few extra days for his arm to recover. Ariel reminded them that the test would be a one-shot practical exam. If they were late, they would be disqualified. No exceptions. No rescheduling. Gray rubbed his arm, thinking about how little strength he could summon in it, and prayed silently that it might feel better by morning. When the next day arrived, his hopes were dashed. His arm was exactly the same. He would have to take the exam in this state. His number was called to the arena entrance. Taking a deep breath, he told himself to focus and not let pessimism take over. His left arm still worked, and he could move his right to a limited extent. The rest would have to come from technique. Before his turn, he studied the examiner in action. The man invited the current examinee to make the first move. The candidate attacked, swinging heavily, but the examiner sidestepped with ease. The candidate shouted in frustration, gripping his sword with both hands for a more forceful strike. The examiner blocked the blow one-handed, crushing the man's spirit in that single display. Then, without hesitation, the examiner surged forward and blasted the examinee off his feet with a single swing. The candidate hit the ground hard, and the match was called over. He was told to retrieve his weapon and leave. Watching this, Gray allowed himself a small, wry smile. He already knew this was going to be impossible. His number was called. As he stepped forward, he could hardly believe he was about to face someone who had just dismantled a larger opponent with one arm. He was told to make the first move. Despite feeling like he had no chance, he resolved to give it everything. He charged, recalling Saria's teachings. That a sword is not swung by the arms alone, but through power generated from the entire body. Even if his right arm was weak, he could drive force through his legs, back, and core. He swung. The examiner ducked under the strike. Nervousness twisted in Gray's gut. This was not his usual way of fighting. If swordsmanship without arm strength were easy, no one would train their arms at all. The examiner countered, and Gray was surprised. The strike was slow enough for him to block. The power was immense, but the speed and technique were nowhere near his master's. If he relied on the swordsmanship Saria had drilled into him, he might be able to compensate for his arm's weakness. His eyes sharpened. The examiner was slower than expected, not as overwhelming as he had feared. Saria's voice echoed in his mind, promising he would pass. Their blades clashed, and for a moment, Gray overpowered him. Hope began to spark. But the fight continued, and the difference in raw power showed. The examiner's form was solid. Breaking through it was no simple task with one arm. Still, Gray saw his movements grow rougher. He baited the examiner in, waiting for the right moment. The man committed to a wide swing, exactly what Gray wanted. Gray shifted his weight, stepped around him, and in an instant was behind him. No matter the gap in strength, if he could get behind, he could win. His blade hovered just an inch from the examiner's back. And then the order to halt rang out. Gray froze, confused. It felt too soon to end. Another examiner announced that the time limit had expired. The result was declared. A draw. Gray's eyes widened. He loosened his grip on his weapon, his body sagging in defeat. He had fought with everything he had, yet could not win. Leaving the arena, he felt the weight of failure pressing heavily. If he could not defeat the examiner here, the road ahead would be steep. He told himself his arm would heal next year, and he would try again. Before stepping out for good, he glanced back at the arena, quietly thanking it for the fight. 1 week later, in meeting room 53 of the World Union Academy, the head of the academy asked the professors for their impressions of the candidates now that the exams had concluded. One complained of exhaustion. An older professor commented that having every instructor observe all candidates together was inefficient, suggesting they divide the workload next year. Another professor disagreed, stating firmly that no amount of convenience was worth the risk of overlooking true talent. The head of the academy sighed, reminding the professors that he had asked for their thoughts on the examinees, not complaints about the system. He began with the swordsmanship course, asking who had passed. The instructors reviewed the recordings. One professor reported that, as always, those who defeated the examiners automatically passed, while the rest would be evaluated based on the quality of their performance and how long they lasted within the 15-minute time limit. He then asked the other swordsmanship instructors for their recommendations. One professor replied that aside from those who won outright, candidates 5,217 and 753 stood out. Another agreed, adding that there was little point in including more, as the rest would struggle to keep pace in class. The first professor asked if anyone disagreed, but no one spoke up. As the meeting moved toward confirming the final list for the swordsmanship course, Professor Ariel spoke up, asking about candidate 513. The head glanced at her, curious. She repeated her question. What did they think of number 513? The screen replayed his match. A professor scoffed, calling him a little guy who had nearly won but relied too much on traps to catch the examiner. Others noted that his technique was solid but his strength was lacking, making it clear he had been outmatched from the start. The brown-haired professor with the mustache dismissed him outright, saying he simply wasn't good enough. The others nodded in agreement. Ariel sat in silence, disbelief creeping across her face. To her, it was astonishing that so many had watched yet failed to notice what she had seen. If everyone was blind to it, she thought, perhaps having all the professors observe together was nothing but a waste. The next day, Gray stood with his exam ticket in hand, waiting for the results of the swordsmanship course. Only 6 names would be called. The air was tense. The first number announced was 5, the exam ticket burning to ash in its owner's hand. Next came 217, followed by 432 and 615, then 753 and 925. That was the end. Gray's heart sank. His number was not called. The successful candidates were told to cross the bridge and complete enrollment by day's end. Cheers erupted around him for the victors, but he stood still, his face shadowed with disappointment. Then came an unexpected announcement, the Divine Eye special admission. Within seconds, his number was called, and his ticket burned with blue flames. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Gray froze, too stunned to react. Around him, whispers turned sharp. Some muttered that the academy must have cheated, that this was a disgrace to its name. He had never heard of this special admission before. Doubt gnawed at him. Had Saria done something? But no, she had never mentioned it. An elderly man silenced the murmurs, declaring that the Divine Eye was a long-standing, prestigious category that had produced heroes for centuries. The crowd scoffed, claiming that prestige was long gone. They pointed to past Divine Eye selections: Amy White, Bella Albright, Leek Muller, Jacob Bloomfield, and mocked them as failures. Gray knew the truth. Those same people had been part of the main force against the Liquidator. Now, his name would stand alongside theirs. An announcement rang out. The entrance ceremony would begin in 30 minutes. Students were instructed to change into their uniforms and gather at the plaza in front of the main office. The uniform was black, bearing the Academy's emblem in silver. Gray looked sharp in his, arriving early at the plaza. A small group had gathered, unsure if they were in the right place. There was no stage or seating. A man rushed toward them, apologizing for the delay and explaining there had been a mix-up. He asked them to step back so stairs could be placed there. Once they moved, he knelt, pressing his palm to the ground. A large magic circle flared to life, and the earth shifted. Before their eyes, an entire structure emerged from nothing. Apologizing again, the man told them they could sit wherever they liked. The students were stunned. Teleportation magic on this scale was almost unheard of. Gray sat down, thinking the Academy had simply wanted a venue where the building could be prominently displayed. Extravagant, yes, but impressive. Some students remarked there were far too many seats for only 30 admits. The girl sitting near Gray admitted she didn't know why. Her life until now had been nothing but sword training. Another explained that the Academy drew top candidates from around the world. She pointed to the sky. The first girl's jaw dropped at the sight of aircraft and dragons flying overhead. Gray's gaze locked on the magic airship Strataqueen. He had boarded it once during the Liquidator subjugation campaign, and it was among the largest airships in existence. That the Academy would use it just for an entrance ceremony was staggering. The airship landed, and more students disembarked. With everyone present, the ceremony began. The headmaster gave his speech. Gray found it dull, just like any other ceremony. The next segment introduced the top students from each course. Leonhardt, the highest ranked in swordsmanship, was called first. As he walked to the stage, students whispered about how he had defeated his examiner instantly. Some even claimed his skill rivaled that of the professors. Gray watched closely. Before reaching the podium, Leonhardt turned to the head staff and asked if he was free to speak his mind. They granted permission, and he gave them a polite thanks. He began by stating that he had a single complaint to make to the Academy. Before addressing it, he offered a formal greeting to his fellow students and those who had earned admission through what he called the proper way. He said it was an honor to stand among them and hoped they would graduate as people capable of making meaningful contributions to the world. He encouraged them to work together, saying he looked forward to the day when they could all aim high as students of the prestigious World Union Academy. Then his tone shifted. He declared that among them were people who did not deserve to be there. He turned to Professor Ariel and asked if he was wrong. She was caught off guard but replied that every student present had passed the Academy's rigorous process. While she admitted some might not match his strength, she argued it would be unwise to exclude them. She then asked him why he had singled her out. Leonhardt's eyes narrowed. He said he was not talking about those who had passed normally, but about the students she had backdoored into the Divine Eye special admission. Then he called for whoever that special admission student was to stand up, return their uniform, and leave the Academy. Tension swept across the plaza. Gray, stunned by Leonhardt's hostility, recalled that the man had been sitting beside him earlier. Relief crept in when he realized Leonhardt didn't know his face. If he stayed silent, he could avoid being drawn into this. Professor Ariel only remarked that the students this year were lively. Leonhardt, feeling ignored, accused her again of letting unqualified students slip in. She didn't respond at first. Then, suddenly, she leaned in and whispered in his ear, asking if he truly believed he was stronger than that kid. The move startled the entire arena. Leonhardt stiffened, then gritted his teeth and answered yes. He asked if she was challenging him to prove it. She smiled faintly and suggested a bet. His interest sharpened. She wagered both her position and the special admission student's enrollment. Gray's confusion grew. He still had no idea what was happening. Leonhardt asked if she intended to make him fight the special admission student. Ariel replied that she would never do something so dull, adding that if Gray went all out, Leonhardt would be dead. As a responsible teacher, she said, she wouldn't risk their lives. Instead, she proposed a safer contest, a monster challenge. She noted that Leonhardt was better at fighting beasts than people. He glared but conceded she knew him well, and asked for the details. She explained that each would face a monster of her choosing, with the creatures increasing in difficulty each round. The first to fail would lose. If Gray lost, she would resign, and all special admission students would be expelled. If Leonhardt lost, he would follow any order she gave. He asked what kind of monsters she meant. Without hesitation, she named the first target, an ogre general, then teased him by asking if that was too easy. The crowd gasped, but Gray remained unreadable, only wondering why she had chosen that enemy. Leonhardt erupted, saying no one could defeat such a creature alone. Ariel clarified that they had an entire year to prepare. That only fueled his anger. He argued that if anyone could solo a disaster-class monster in a year, there would be no monster problem in the first place. Then, catching his breath, he accused her of making the task impossible just to avoid a clear winner. Confidently, he announced he wouldn't play along. Ariel smirked and added one last condition. If it ended in a draw, Leonhardt would be the winner. She repeated the stakes. If Gray failed to kill the ogre general, she would be fired and the special admits expelled. She asked him what he thought. He stared at her as if she'd lost her mind, convinced the bet was stacked against her. She took his silence as consent. He warned her it had better not be a weakened ogre general. She calmly assured him it would not. With a flick of her hand, a feather pen appeared in the air, and a magic contract materialized. She told him the terms were already written. If he had no objections, he could sign. He read it, then agreed, though he couldn't help asking if she truly believed the boy could win. Her answer was ambiguous. Who knows? Before she returned to her seat. Other professors whispered, questioning her sanity. Some speculated she was using this as an excuse to retire. It wasn't impossible, she was past her prime. Gray understood he had no choice now. The bet was set. Yet something gnawed at him. Why had she included the monster he had already fought before enrollment, despite giving a full year's deadline? She met his gaze, then pressed a finger to her lips. He understood. She was playing dirty. The opening ceremony concluded, and students dispersed to their assigned classes. The first subject was basic magic. Some were surprised to begin lessons on the very first day, but the academy wasted no time. Every moment counted. The professor began with the fundamentals. How to harness and channel magic. The professor began his lecture by explaining that the human body contains a hidden energy called ether, which can be guided through the body's magic circuits to cast spells. He scribbled diagrams on the board as he spoke, his tone confident and precise. Gray sat quietly in the back of the classroom. At first, he worried about whether he could keep up, but soon he realized this was the same material he'd learned back in boot camp. So far, so easy. But there was one serious problem. Of all the classes he could have been assigned, he'd ended up in the same one as Leonhardt. Gray silently prayed that Leonhardt wouldn't find out he was the Divine Eye special admission student. The professor caught him staring off and called him out for losing focus barely 5 minutes into the lesson. Gray was shocked. He'd only glanced away for a moment and he was all the way in the back. He quickly apologized. The professor challenged him. If he looked so confident, why not prove it in front of the class? He even taunted him, saying he must at least know basic magic. Gray politely explained that since they were in the swordsmanship course, he thought magic ability wasn't a requirement. The professor disagreed. Even a swordsman, he said, should know the basics of magic, at the very least to coordinate effectively with mages. Understanding simple spells and how they feel in use was essential. Gray recognized the explanation. It was exactly the same one from boot camp. He asked if they would be learning Ether Bullet. The professor's brow lifted, and he asked if Gray could already use it. Gray confirmed that he could, silently thanking his grueling boot camp training. Seeing an opportunity, the professor decided to make things interesting. He announced that Leonhardt, whom he called Leon, could also use Ether Bullet. Leonhardt confirmed this and remarked that he'd trained in both swordsmanship and magic long before entering the academy, implying it might be risky for someone else to face him. The professor brushed it off. It was just ether bullets, after all. No one was going to die. He added that he wouldn't ask Leonhardt to hold back either. Then, with a sly smile, he revealed to the entire class that Gray was the Divine Eye student for the year. Every head turned toward Gray. He felt the trouble closing in. The professor looked almost gleeful at the stir he'd caused. Leonhardt's gaze hardened. He said he would show Gray the reality of the academy, then told him to step forward. They faced each other. The professor explained that at his signal, they would fire ether bullets at the same time. Gray knew he'd only trained in magic for a few days during boot camp, and even if the professor claimed it wouldn't be fatal, he doubted it would end without injury. The signal came. Leonhardt launched a small orb of pale blue light. Gray's own casting produced a much larger, intensely glowing sphere. The reaction was immediate. Faces froze, murmurs stopped. Even Gray stared, surprised, as his ether bullet completely overpowered Leonhardt's. A sharp cry escaped Leonhardt as the professor hurriedly threw up a barrier. But the barrier cracked, then shattered, allowing the blast to knock Leonhardt off his feet. A wave of wind and light swept through the room, rattling desks and making students shield their eyes. Leonhardt groaned from the floor, but managed to stand, insisting he was fine. The professor exhaled in relief, though his mind was elsewhere. That shot could have killed Leonhardt outright if the barrier hadn't softened the impact. And what unsettled him more, he didn't know a single professor who could produce an ether bullet that strong. He turned to Gray and demanded to know what he'd just done. Gray was genuinely puzzled. Leonhardt's ether bullet had felt weak, almost like it was a different spell entirely. He wondered if the ether bullet he'd learned in the subjugation squad was different from the Academy's version. He asked if perhaps he had used the wrong spell. The professor assured him it was still ether bullet, but it was made from super compressed ether, not the normal kind. The class erupted in whispers. Many had never even heard of such a thing. The professor admitted that even skilled mages struggled to control super compressed ether. Yet Gray had produced it, and shaped it into a perfect spell. He said there was no one else in the academy capable of that feat. Some students began to believe this was exactly why the Divine Eye admission existed. Others argued Gray should have been placed in the magic course from the start. Gray, however, felt uneasy. Every spell he'd learned at boot camp had been like this. Back then, he'd been nothing special compared to his squadmates. He told the professor that with enough practice, anyone should be able to do it. The professor burst into laughter, loud and incredulous. Then he suddenly gripped Gray's shoulders and declared that he should transfer to the magic course, promising to personally vouch for him. In his opinion, Gray was more talented in magic than in swordsmanship. Gray declined politely, saying he'd always been told he wasn't good at magic. That only made the professor laugh harder. He called Gray a once-in-a-generation genius, a prodigy the academy would be mad to waste. He said whoever told Gray he lacked magical talent clearly didn't know what they were talking about, and insisted again that Gray should switch. The room went silent. This professor was famous for rarely praising anyone, yet here he was, praising Gray relentlessly. Gray laughed awkwardly, but then something clicked. He remembered exactly where he'd first heard about ether compression. In his previous life, at boot camp, someone had told him that in the old days people didn't even know about ood, life force, and that proper magic was much harder to cast back then. Mages had to compress ether and hope it mixed with ood by chance. A woman with pale blue hair and golden eyes had once called that method pathetic. Back in the present, Gray asked the professor if he had ever heard of ood. The confused look on the man's face told him everything. This world didn't know it existed. He realized what this meant. The techniques he'd learned were knowledge from the future, and he knew he had to keep that to himself. The professor circled back, asking again if Gray wanted to transfer. Gray bowed and declined firmly, saying his heart was with the sword. The professor accepted, but told him to come see him anytime if he changed his mind. From now on, he added, Gray could leave class early or look as bored as he wanted. The lecture was far too basic for him anyway. The other students were shocked. Meanwhile, Leonhardt watched Gray with an unreadable expression, one hand pressed to his chest. His cheeks flushed faintly as he addressed him as Lord Gray. The sudden shift in tone made Gray shiver. It was unsettling. Later that day, Gray received a letter from Professor Ariel asking him to come to her office. The unexpected summons left him wondering if she, too, was going to push him toward the magic course. When he arrived, she called out that the door was unlocked. He stepped inside, only to be attacked without warning. Instinct kicked in. His sword was in his hand, deflecting the strike with ease. The girl who had attacked froze in shock. Gray stared at her, equally startled. Her face, it was familiar, like someone he had seen before. Gray felt a strange pull of recognition, certain he had seen her somewhere before. From the far side of the room, the sound of slow, deliberate applause broke the silence. Professor Ariel's voice followed, warm but amused, as she remarked that it was not bad at all. Seated casually on a chair by the window, she smiled and said she had known her eyes hadn't deceived her. Two other instructors walked over. One of them asked Bella if she had held back in that attack, or if Ariel had told her to go easy. The other added that her movements had been flawless, yet her projectile had been knocked away far too easily. It looked unnatural. Gray's heart skipped a beat at the name. Bella Albright, the sorceress. Ariel cut them off, her tone suddenly sharp. She asked if they were being serious. If they couldn't even tell whether Bella had held back, then perhaps they should resign from their posts as professors. The two exchanged awkward glances, raising their hands in surrender and saying they were only joking. Bella opened her palm in a small gesture of defeat and admitted, a little unwillingly, that unfortunately she had to confess the truth. Gray, still tense, asked what exactly they were doing. Ariel smiled and explained that they had made a bet on whether he could block Bella's sudden strike. Thanks to him, she had won a tidy sum. She flipped a gold coin toward him, telling him it was his share. He stared at it, stunned. A gold coin. For him, it was a small fortune. One of the other instructors looked at Gray with a thoughtful expression and said that from their earlier exchange, it seemed as though he had deliberately avoided using his dominant hand, almost as if he were protecting an arm that couldn't move properly. Another asked if they thought it was due to an injury. The first replied that rather than obvious physical damage to the muscles, it seemed more like something deeper. Bella agreed, saying that a simple injury alone couldn't cause that kind of reaction. Gray felt his chest tighten. These people could see through far too much with a single glance. One of the instructors remarked that if they couldn't at least notice such things, they wouldn't be qualified to teach at the academy. They also noted that Ariel had seemed aware of it back during the exam. Ariel brushed her hair back and told the other two that if they understood now, they could leave. Gray was her student, and she would not give him up. The two exchanged a look, and one said they would, for now, acknowledge his potential. But one added that nonetheless, if his injury doesn't heal, that would still mean that he fails to meet the academy's admission standards. With that, they left. Ariel then told Gray that she had heard from Professor Carlos about his use of super-compressed ether in class. She lifted her coffee cup and said that meant he already knew what it was. She added that Carlos had come to her office requesting that Gray be transferred to the magic course, but she had, of course, refused. Setting the cup down, her gaze sharpened, telling him she believed he was more suited to the sword than to magic. Bella added that from what she had seen, he didn't even look like he practiced magic compression at all. There were no signs of training in it. Ariel's eyes could tell in an instant. Gray took a sip of coffee and thought it best not to lie here. He admitted she was correct. Ariel then asked if he minded telling her what trick he had used, promising to keep it secret and even reward him. Resting a hand on Bella's shoulder, she said she truly needed to know, for this girl's sake, for the sorceress's sake. He repeated, then correcting himself quickly to say, for Bella's sake. Gray thought he had nearly called her sorceress aloud. Ariel explained that while Bella was a genius in magical theory, her practical application was far from top tier. Ariel lowered her head and admitted that for some reason, she simply couldn't master ether compression, and that was why she couldn't produce super compressed ether. Gray recalled hearing of Bella Albright's reputation as a late bloomer, and now understood the reason behind her limitation. Ariel continued, saying that according to Carlos, when Gray had used super compressed ether, it hadn't looked like he was compressing at all. If there were a way to use it without actually compressing, Bella wouldn't have to be sent to Professor Bradley. The name made Gray's hand tremble around his cup. He asked if she meant Varian Bradley. Ariel confirmed it, noting that of course Gray knew the man. His notoriety was impossible to miss. Bradley had conducted countless human experiments, killing many in the process, and had caused a magical disaster that took tens of thousands of lives. He was one of history's most vile magical criminals. In this time period, he hadn't yet been caught. Ariel explained that if Bella couldn't produce super compressed ether by the end of the year, she would be sent to him for surgery. Gray was horrified. That was clearly a terrible idea. Ariel confirmed it, saying that while the operation was presented as a means to enhance magical ability, it was, in truth, human experimentation. The matter wasn't public knowledge, but rumors spoke of many who had died or been ruined because of it. Bella admitted it was dangerous and frightening, but if she couldn't use super compressed ether by year's end, she would be expelled. Ariel told her bluntly that she would rather see her drop out than let that man destroy her body. Gray's fists clenched. He knew magic the people of this time had never heard of. If he revealed it, he might alter the course of history. But the vision of a bloody future and his companions' gruesome deaths rose in his mind. Damn it, he thought, if that hellish future could be changed, all the better. He set down his cup and said he understood. He would teach Bella how to use super compressed ether. Later, in the arena, the setting sun cast a warm glow over the space. Gray drew diagrams on the board, explaining everything he knew about magic. He reminded them that, as agreed, they must never tell anyone he had taught them. Ariel smiled, saying of course, and that they had even signed a magical contract to ensure it. If either of them broke the deal, they would both die. Gray asked what she thought of his lecture. Ariel brushed her hair aside and said that simply knowing about the existence of Ood was enough to open her eyes, but the knowledge he had revealed went far beyond that. Bella added that his explanation was concise and well-structured, saying it felt like listening to a magic lecture from 100 years in the future. Her eyes gleamed as she said that just hearing his words had likely advanced magical history by a century. Gray, however, knew it was actually knowledge from only 10 years ahead, though to them, it must have felt like 100. Ariel admitted there was much she couldn't yet judge, and asked Bella if she thought his words could be true. Bella said it was very possible, as nothing he said contradicted current magical theory. Ariel concluded that the quickest way to know was to test it, and that was why they were there. Bella turned to Gray, saying that if everything he said was true, then this spell should succeed. She raised her staff, and a golden magic circle unfolded from her staff. She said this was her full power. Gray stared in disbelief. Bella Albright's full strength was said to be capable of burning an entire city to ash, and she was infamous for struggling to control her immense magical tome. Blinding beams of light burst from her staff, flooding the entire arena with brilliance. Even she froze in surprise as a massive column of energy roared skyward, tearing a huge crater into the arena's center with an earth-shaking explosion. He reels back, eyes wide, and he shouts to Wada Seiko, as a golden pillar detonates from the circle and spears the sky. The blast peels across the arena in rings. Heat and light whip past him like knives. He throws himself into the surge, blades of radiance passing a breath from his face, and braces against the shock. Fire curls toward him, and he hunches behind his forearm, forcing his stance to hold. He thinks that if she didn't manage to control it at the last second, he would already be ash. The wall of flame cinches into a ring around his body, and he watches it spin, alive and obedient. He thinks, with a sharp exhale, that it literally saved his life. Bella, framed in the maelstrom, lifts her staff in both hands and says that she did it. She adds, a little breathless, that she tried controlling it too. The spell screams downward like a comet and slams into the arena's heart. The inferno blossoms, then keeps blooming. A dragon of light writhes out of the impact, its coils clawing at the dusk. Bella laughs up at it and says that it is so fun, then staggers midair and mutters that. But, before dropping with her cloak fluttering, she says that she is out of mana. Gray lunges and catches her before she hits the floor, easing her down against him and telling her to relax. A moment later, Bella's breathing evens, her face slack with sudden sleep. Gray, checking her pulse, explains that she simply fell asleep because she ran out of ether. He looks up as Professor Ariel, the red-haired woman, strides through the settling cinders. She remarks that still, that was marvelous. She tips her chin toward the fire-scarred arena and says that to think she put together magic on that scale in such a short amount of time. Bella, half drowsing against Gray, mumbles that it's not her who is amazing. It's the theory. She adds that she can create super compressed ether. Gray answers with a wry smile that it's her theory, though. Professor Ariel considers them, then nods once and states that now that Bella can create super compressed ether, she no longer needs the surgery. She says that she will tell Bradley herself to call it off. She looks back to the towering afterimage of flame and says she's glad they avoided the risky surgery, but she's especially glad Bella didn't lose her magic control. Gray, following her gaze, asks warily about her magic control. Professor Ariel answers yes, and explains that although Bradley's surgery can increase one's magical output, it comes at the expense of control. She continues that exactly how it works is a secret, but it seems to be a surgery that forcibly breaks one's limiter. Gray rubs his jaw and says that is that so, then wonders if the reason the sorceress from his past life couldn't control her powerful magic was because of that surgery. The thought trails. Ariel cuts across gently that in any case, thanks to him, Bella is now able to create super compressed ether, thus fulfilling the terms of their contract. She squares to Gray, violet sigils unfurling at her fingertips, and tells him that now it's her turn to fulfill her part of the contract. She adds, first of all, about his arm. There's magic she wants to use on it. A cool, cerulean radiance blossoms. Rings, runes, and bright moth-like butterflies of light spill from her hand and whirl around Gray's ruined forearm. The glow knits and threads. Sparks drift like snow in deep water. The storm of blue wings rises and then dissolves. Ariel studies the hand as sensation returns and asks how it is. Gray flexes, astonished, and says that he can move it. He clenches a fist and adds, breathless, "Thank you so much, Professor." He frowns, remembering months of failure, and says that not even a magic healing potion could cure it. So how? She gives a small, pleased sound and instructs him not to compare her nerves restoring magic with average magic healing potions. Then, with a measuring look, she asks if it really moves the way it used to. She gestures toward the practice yard and tells him to try swinging a sword and find out. He answers yes. He retrieves his blade and cuts the air, once, twice, testing the arc. He pauses, feels for the old rhythm, and then admits that it doesn't feel like it moves as well as it used to. Ariel nods, as she thought. She explains that she may have repaired his nerves, but her magic can't heal the wounds in his soul. Gray blinks and echoes in a low voice, his soul. Ariel meets his eyes and says yes, he heard that right. She adds that today's magic technologies haven't proven the existence of one's soul yet, but she believes it does. Professor Ariel lifts her hand toward her glowing right eye and, with a cool certainty, she says that after all, she can see it with that eye of hers. She says that even now his soul is slowly healing. She says that it will heal naturally as long as he does not overexert himself. Gray glances at his hand, thinking to himself, not to overexert himself. He asks if he should refrain from practicing with swords then. She answers that not at all. She says that it is fine if he exercises as he normally would. Rather than that, she says that she would like to know what kind of swordsmanship could harm one's soul like that. Gray laughs weakly. She explains that it is just that she learned a handful of swordsmanship that uses one's soul to move the sword. Professor Ariel, watching him, suddenly says the name, Amy White, and then she asks if he knows her, right? Gray's mind stutters with a startled huh. He thinks that why is he even surprised? He thinks that in the present day a professor can easily find out even things like that. She tilts her head and asks, is she wrong? She adds that the way he wields his sword gives the impression he learned it from Amy. On second thought, she says, it may be a result of training. She goes on to say that the person he learned swordsmanship from seems to be a bit more skilled than Amy, although, she adds, give it a few years and Amy will be just as skilled as his master. Gray thinks in shock that she even knew that far. Gray, trying to steer away, says that he learned his swordsmanship at a dojo in his hometown. He thinks that he has to change the topic. He thinks that if he lets this conversation continue, he might end up spilling everything. He asks if it is even possible for one's soul to be damaged because of swordsmanship. She replies not at all. She says that at the very least, not by ordinary swordsmanship. To begin with, she says, there is no way something ordinary could defeat an ogre general with just one slash, not to mention cutting down the surrounding ogres and trees too. Gray says that so she already knew. She answers of course, and with a playful flourish she says that thanks to him she has practically won the bet. She adds that she was shown some of the remains left at the scene and that they were incongruent. She says that not even the most advanced cleaving magic could have done that. Fixing him with that luminous eye, she says that the mysterious power within him, he stares back, tense. She continues by saying that he used it, didn't he? Gray asks if she can see it with her eye, Professor. She says of course she can. She says that she can see the power leaking through the chained door. Gray's eyes narrow as that phrase, chained door, echoes through him. Gray thinks that it is not just something one can figure out by himself. Professor Ariel, however, says that being said, she has seen power similar to his before, though she says that she does not think they are the same thing, just that they have a similar vibe. Gray repeats, similar power, He asks if there are others with powers similar to his. She says yes, though she says she is not sure if they are human or not. Then she names them. She says that they are called the Liquidator. She arches a brow and says, so he has heard of them. Her golden eye gleams, and Gray's thoughts spike. He wonders why that name. Why is that name being mentioned in this time period? Professor Ariel hadn't expected the young man to be familiar with such an obscure being. Then again, she reminded herself, he possessed knowledge of futuristic magical theories, so perhaps it wasn't too shocking after all. Gray, meanwhile, felt uncomfortable receiving credit for a revolutionary idea when, in truth, he was merely repeating what he'd learned from the real genius. Intrigued, Ariel asked how much he actually knew about the so-called Liquidator. Gray admitted that he didn't know much, but he insisted that the creature was an existential threat to humanity. One that must be stopped before it could amass greater power. He said that it was something that had to be destroyed, no matter the cost. Ariel found his view a little too extreme, though she agreed the Liquidator was dangerous. Still, she explained that Professor Balian Bradley was intent on continuing his experiments related to the being. Gray asked what Balian Bradley had to do with the Liquidator. She replied that from what she knew, the Liquidator was the very entity Bradley was trying to summon. That revelation shocked Gray. No one had ever told him that the world's future enemy originated from Bradley's own research. As he reflected, Gray realized that the Academy, at least in his previous timeline, had been the center of it all. The higher-ups had acted as if they already knew when and where the Liquidator would appear. It now seemed likely that the World Union Academy itself had played a direct role in summoning the creature. Both the professor and the secretive freshman agreed that this reckless experiment had to be stopped before it spiraled out of control. Unfortunately, the one conducting it was a tenured professor, and Ariel lacked the authority to intervene. She explained that she had already tried to convince the higher administration to act, but her efforts were ignored. Moreover, she said she wasn't allowed to reveal any further details to a student. Unless orders came from above, no one could legally stop Balian Bradley's madness. Gray had hoped at least to learn the names of the Academy's decision-makers, but that, too, was out of reach. It appeared the Academy's leadership was far more entangled than he had imagined. Still, he reasoned that if he could prove Bradley's criminality, they might finally have enough leverage to take action. In his last life, Balian's illegal experiments had killed tens of thousands, and Gray knew exactly where those atrocities had taken place. He considered sharing that information with Ariel to catch the maniac in the act, but she immediately rejected the idea. Entering another professor's private lab without permission, she said, was a serious offense, punishable by imprisonment. They would need to find another way to gather evidence. However, if Gray could provide concrete proof soon, things might change. For now, they had no choice but to wait. Ariel knew the risks but was bound by politics and bureaucracy. It was frustrating for both of them, but understandable. Shifting the topic, she expressed curiosity about Gray's mysterious power. She hinted that there might be a way for him to control it and mentioned a professor who specialized in unknown forces. Heathcote Longfellow. Gray immediately recognized the name. Longfellow was the man who had once trained the Sword Saint herself. A legendary figure. Ariel knew that would get his attention. She promised to arrange a private session for the following day. Grateful, Gray accepted. After all, mastering his dangerous power was the reason he came to the Academy in the first place. He hadn't expected a solid lead so quickly. For once, things were beginning to look up. The next morning, Gray stood before the stoic Professor Longfellow, ready for his first private lesson. Ariel had worked fast. Expecting complex theory or intense sparring, Gray was surprised when the older man took him deep into the woods, and ordered him to run. They were still within Academy grounds, surrounded by dense forest. As Gray wondered about the purpose of this strange exercise, Longfellow scolded him for letting his thoughts wander. The professor told him to focus solely on running, to push his body until nothing remained. According to Longfellow, the soul's true power only awakens when the body is utterly exhausted. Gray wasn't allowed to touch his sword until every ounce of stamina was burned away. He couldn't yet grasp the lesson's deeper meaning, but he trusted Longfellow's methods completely. Still, while he ran lap after lap, the thought of Balian Bradley conducting inhuman experiments gnawed at his mind. The knowledge of what was to come weighed heavily on him. Gray endured the training for an entire week. On the 7th day, he was summoned back to Professor Ariel's office. Feeling a bit embarrassed, he confessed that all he had done was run and perform a few basic drills. Still, he admitted he felt a slight improvement in strength. Ariel laughed, clearly familiar with Longfellow's eccentric methods. Before their conversation could continue, a messenger entered the room and handed Ariel a sealed envelope. She opened it immediately, her expression darkening with each line she read. By the time she finished, she was frozen in shock. Concerned, Gray asked what was wrong. Without a word, she passed him the letter. It was from Balian Bradley. The letter stated that Bradley had reviewed the report regarding Bella Albright's ether compression breakthrough. He claimed that, despite appearances, the girl had not achieved the level claimed, and thus her success could not be recognized. Therefore, he wrote, the surgical contract remained valid and the procedure would proceed as scheduled. It was madness, an insult wrapped in official language. Ariel was furious. Bradley was determined to seize Bella as a test subject, forcing her into a dangerous, unnecessary operation. The contract she had signed was airtight. Unless Bradley himself voided it, she would have to either submit to the procedure or face expulsion. Gray refused to accept such injustice. Ariel agreed. The absurdity of the letter finally pushed her past the limits of patience and politics. She said she needed Gray's help to locate Bradley's hidden laboratory. It was time to expose him for the criminal he was and nullify the contract through undeniable proof. This was exactly what Gray had been waiting for. With a hint of irony, he asked why she had suddenly decided to take action after previously insisting that such a move was too risky. Ariel responded that they were far beyond legal boundaries now. She explained that she trusted Gray completely and that protecting her students mattered more than protocol. Deep down, she had known he was telling the truth all along. It just took one insane letter to make her admit it. Now, she was ready. Gray would lead the way, armed with knowledge of the future, and together they would expose Balian Bradley's crimes against humanity once and for all. As far as Gray knew, the vile laboratory was hidden deep within the mountains near the village of Toruil. Professor Ariel vaguely recalled hearing that one of the faculty members had once been granted authorization to construct a facility there. That revelation confirmed the worst. Those illegal, inhumane experiments had been sanctioned by the Academy itself. There was no better place to conceal such horrors than the desolate Toruil range. Hardly anyone ventured there, and even fewer would question a professor's prolonged absence. To make matters worse, Academy professors followed an unspoken rule never to meddle in each other's research. Still, Ariel reasoned that if they could gather enough evidence proving crimes against humanity, they wouldn't be condemned for trespassing. While they were mapping out their strategy, a knock echoed through the office door. Bella entered, clutching a letter in trembling hands. Her face was pale, her eyes red. The letter she carried contained devastating news, and her emotions spiraled between despair and anger. Ariel quickly took the letter from her, promising that the situation would be handled one way or another. It became clear that Ariel intended to confront Varian Bradley on her own, a notion Bella immediately rejected. She declared with fiery confidence that she could take on the madman herself if necessary. The young woman then turned to Gray with pleading eyes, silently begging him to stop the professor from going alone. Gray promised that he would accompany Ariel. His resolve gave Bella courage, and she volunteered to join as well. She said that she didn't want to stand by while others fought her battle. Ariel initially objected. She explained that Varian Bradley was not only an experienced scholar but also a deranged individual with no value for human life. If he caught inexperienced students meddling in his work, there was no telling what he might do to them. As the adult in the room, she said she couldn't allow them to take that risk. Gray countered that her going alone was even more dangerous. He stated that he could call upon the same power he once used to defeat an ogre general if the situation demanded it. He assured her that he wouldn't be a burden. Besides, he argued, if something were to happen to Ariel, the Divine Eye program would likely be dissolved, which would destroy any chance for him and his peers to remain at the Academy. He said that he preferred to take charge of his own destiny rather than have it dictated by others. Ariel saw the unwavering determination in their faces and realized she couldn't dissuade them. They would go, whether she allowed it or not. Reluctantly, she agreed to make it an official team operation, but under one strict condition. Their safety would always come first. Both Gray and Bella accepted without hesitation. After taking several precautionary measures, the trio set off into the misty Toruel Mountains. There, hidden between jagged peaks and twisted trees, stood Varian Bradley's sprawling private laboratory. Its massive structure loomed before them like a mausoleum built for the damned. It was hard to imagine what horrors were being performed inside those walls. Their mission was simple: collect undeniable evidence of his crimes and get out. Gray's eyes burned with anger as he confirmed they had found the right place. Bella, on the other hand, felt the first stirrings of fear. She doubted whether they could make it out unscathed. Ariel reassured them that her information was solid. Varian Bradley was supposed to be attending the Magic Society's conference at this very hour. The facility should be empty. Still, she warned that the main entrance was likely rigged with traps. The safest route would be through a side wall. After all, breaking into an Academy-authorized laboratory was already a serious offense, so it made no difference how they entered. Before they began, Ariel gave Bella one last chance to back out. Bella clutched her staff and shook her head. She asked if the professor was truly willing to go through all this for someone like her. Gray replied that this mission wasn't just about saving Bella. It was about stopping Varian's monstrous plans before they doomed countless others. He said that the fate of the world itself might depend on it. Ariel thought his statement sounded overly dramatic, but she agreed that the madman had to be stopped. She told Bella to stop blaming herself. This wasn't just her burden to bear. With that, Ariel led the charge, pulling Bella along while Gray sprinted beside them. When they reached the towering side wall of the laboratory, Ariel raised her hand and unleashed a powerful fire spell. Streams of blazing energy tore through the reinforced concrete, exploding outward with a deafening roar. The entire mountain lit up with blinding flames. One thing was certain: Ariel knew how to make an entrance. Gray was the first to step forward and peer into the gaping hole. What he saw froze his blood. The long corridor beyond was lined with prison cells stretching into darkness. Inside those cages were emaciated figures, barely recognizable as human. Some were unconscious, others were bleeding or missing limbs. A few appeared already dead. They had expected to find evidence of crimes, but not this soon, not this gruesome. Proof of Varian's atrocities was everywhere. As they moved down the hallway, every iron cell revealed more victims, each one broken by forbidden experiments. Ariel quickly noted traces of 14 separate outlawed spells, any one of which would be enough to condemn him. The sheer scope of the human rights violations was staggering. Eventually, they reached a massive chamber at the heart of the facility. The floor was slick with dried and fresh blood, and in the center lay a massive magic circle glowing faintly crimson. It resembled a ritual altar, pulsing with residual energy. Their initial plan had been simple: get evidence and leave, but Bella couldn't bear to abandon the prisoners. She said that they couldn't just walk away. Gray, however, sensed danger. Something felt terribly wrong. He warned that a rescue would take too long and that Varian could return at any moment. Before they could decide, a figure materialized from the shadows ahead. He moved leisurely, almost arrogantly, as though strolling through his garden. Ariel immediately recognized the man's grotesque face and the madness in his eyes. It was Varian Bradley himself, the twisted genius responsible for all this. Gray instantly drew his sword, bracing for a fight. Varian sneered and announced that the man attending the conference in his place was merely a double. He said that he was on the verge of a major breakthrough and couldn't possibly leave now. The true nightmare had just begun. Varian Bradley bragged that he had recently secured some exceptionally fresh materials for an important ceremony. He explained that he preferred his human test subjects alive, flesh still warm, hearts still beating, because their energy produced far better magical results. But upon seeing Professor Ariel and her two beloved students standing in his lair, he decided to alter his plans. Ariel's instincts screamed with alarm. She feared for her students' safety. Bella stood frozen in place, her body locked by primal terror, while Gray's grip on his sword tightened, his every muscle ready to strike. Varian sneered that this night's experiment might yield extraordinary results after all. After all, what could be more powerful than live subjects with exceptional magical potential? He muttered that he didn't know how they had discovered his secret facility, but he was certain they had come here unofficially. That meant no one else knew their location. If they were to vanish, no one would ever find their bodies. He laughed softly, confident that whatever gruesome fate awaited them would never raise suspicion. That wicked grin alone was enough to make anyone wish for his immediate execution. From his rambling, it was clear that Varian intended to turn them into living catalysts, to stretch the limits of magic through human suffering. Since they had seen too much, leaving them alive was no longer an option. He decided that if they were to die, he would at least make use of their potential first. As he launched into a pompous monologue about transcending human limitations, a blinding explosion of fire interrupted him. The spell struck the room with a violent burst, scorching everything in sight. But to his surprise, the attack hadn't come from Professor Ariel, it came from Bella Albright herself. Her fear had vanished, replaced by raw determination. She had acted before anyone else could. Yet, despite her courage, the strike failed to hit its mark. Varian had raised a magical barrier just in time, the flames dispersing harmlessly around him. Still, he commended the girl's talent and quick judgment, remarking that Ariel's divine eye had clearly chosen well. He even mused that perhaps he should pay closer attention to that controversial special admission batch in the future. Even so, he declared that an academy student trying to assassinate a professor was laughable. The gap in power was simply too vast. Bella, however, had already accepted that if she was going to die, she'd rather go down fighting than wait to be slaughtered. Ariel, seeing how the situation was spiraling, ordered her students to retreat. She insisted that they already had the evidence they needed. The academy could handle the rest. But Varian had no intention of letting them escape. Before they could move, he unleashed a surge of burning black energy from his scepter. The dark spell targeted Bella, who froze like a deer in headlights. Ariel acted instantly, summoning a radiant barrier to protect her students. The searing energy struck, consuming everything in its path. Varian taunted them, saying that defensive magic was useless against his gluttony flame, the result of years of painstaking research. The spell, he explained with glee, devoured magic itself, feeding on barriers and turning their energy into fuel. It was nearly indestructible, he claimed, its only drawback being the rare biological materials required to cast it. As he spoke, Ariel's barrier began to crumble. The gluttony flame gnawed at her defense, growing stronger with every moment. Gritting her teeth, she called upon the divine eye, channeling its mysterious power to hold the fire at bay. She managed to erect a second barrier just before the first shattered entirely. But the second layer met the same fate. The black flames tore through it in seconds. Knowing she couldn't last long, Ariel threw a spell memory pouch toward Bella and Gray. She said that if Heathcote Longfellow ever received it, he would know what to do. Bella, however, refused to flee. Instead of running, she erected a barrier of her own to reinforce her mentors. Ariel panicked, shouting that this wasn't what they agreed on. She reminded Bella that their deal was clear: if things went wrong, survival came first. Varian's power was far beyond anything they could handle. Even as Ariel protested, her spell finally collapsed. The impact sent a painful shock through her body, but Bella immediately filled the gap. Her translucent barrier flared up, matching the black flames with astonishing precision. Bella analyzed the attack in real time, realizing that the spell wasn't invincible. It simply required a different magical frequency to counteract. The moment she adjusted her defense, the flames stalled. For the first time, Varian looked genuinely surprised. He shouted in disbelief, demanding to know how a mere student could have deciphered the countermeasure to such an advanced spell. Bella calmly replied that someone special had recently shared some unconventional theories with her, someone whose insights had made every form of magic easier to understand. The realization made Varian's fury explode. He accused her of treachery and demanded the name of his supposed betrayer. With infuriating innocence, Bella refused to answer. She said that her mentor was just a student from the swordsmanship division who enjoyed rambling about crazy ideas. Varian's composure cracked completely. His veins bulged as he screamed, grabbing a blood-red crystal from his coat. He crushed it in his fist, and the imprisoned souls inside howled as they were consumed by his spell. The gluttony flame swelled monstrously, morphing into a living inferno with a grotesque, hungry face. Though the sight was horrific, Bella admitted that his magic, in a purely technical sense, was magnificent. Still, she could feel her mana draining fast. Bradley estimated she could hold the barrier for maybe a minute longer. Ariel, realizing this, switched to offense. Using her divine eye, she scanned the flow of magic and spotted a vulnerable point where the energy thinned. If she could project her mana just beyond Bella's barrier, she might land a decisive blow. Threads of luminous mana coiled around her fingers and shot toward the weak spot, but the flames devoured them instantly. Varian mocked her pitiful attempt, laughing that her offensive power was as weak as her convictions. Gray remembered hearing that Professor Ariel's specialty was not attack spells but perception. Against a spell that fed on energy, even her most focused strikes would only make it stronger. Bella's stamina was fading. Her arms trembled as the barrier began to waver. Ariel's expression darkened. This was exactly why she had wanted them to run. With no other choice, Gray stepped forward. Bella questioned how he planned to reach Varian through the raging storm of magic. Gray, unfazed, said that he could handle it. Ariel immediately understood what he intended and shouted for him to stop. She warned that using his mysterious power again could destroy his healing arm, or even kill him outright. But Gray saw no alternative. One of them had to end this, and he would rather die alone than watch them both perish. In an instant, he moved. His body blurred through the roaring fire, a burst of crimson light illuminating the room. The gluttony flame split open as if cleaved by the will of a god. Varian barely had time to comprehend what had happened. The last thing he saw was Gray's blood-streaked sword flashing before his eyes, followed by the sharp separation of his own head from his shoulders. Just like that, the infamous Professor Varian Bradley met his end, executed on the spot for his countless crimes. And the young man who struck him down, bleeding yet unbroken, was the one destined to alter the course of history forever. Blood streaked the crimson hall, splattering the walls as two figures stood amid the wreckage. Bella lifted her gaze, lips parting in shock as she muttered a stunned sound. The cloaked body before them crumpled and skidded across the floor, leaving a slick trail behind. Professor Ariel adjusted her monocle, eyes narrowing to razor points, and admitted that it was her first time seeing the real thing with her own eyes, then added, with measured disbelief, that the sight was staggering. The ceiling above them groaned. Blue slashes had carved into the vaulted stone, forming a fractured grid that began to collapse. Pebbles rained first, then heavy chunks of rubble. Bella flinched back and cried out in alarm, glancing upward just as the red-haired professor stepped forward. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor. With a flick of her wrist, crimson sigils spiraled into a glowing lattice, catching the tumbling debris mid-air and lowering it aside with surgical precision. Exhaling, she rubbed her temple and admitted that the result had far exceeded her expectations. Her gaze then flicked toward the dark-haired boy, voice softening as she asked if his body was holding up. Gray flexed his right hand, feeling a dull ache pulse up his arm, and replied that it hurt quite a bit, numb too, but still functional. Ariel assessed his stance and remarked that his training was clearly paying off. He nodded slightly, conceding that it seemed that way. His mind drifted back to his past self back in the village. Back then, he thought, an impact like that would have left him bedridden for days. Now, it only left his arm throbbing. He allowed himself a faint smile, realizing that his training had truly paid off. Memory flickered through him. His stern white-haired mentor laughing, insisting that once the fundamentals were mastered, any weapon could be wielded naturally. He gripped his cracked sword and met Ariel's gaze in silence. Then, lowering his head, she thanked him for saving them and apologized for forcing him to use that power. He waved it off, saying that she shouldn't worry. After all, he was the one who insisted they confront Varian Bradley. She expressed quiet gratitude, then added a warning. She told him not to use that mysterious power again for a while, or the damage might become permanent. The numbness still lingered in his arm, so he bowed his head and agreed. Gray cleared his throat and awkwardly apologized as Bella approached, eyes wide with curiosity. She asked if what he had just used was some kind of magic, noting that she hadn't sensed any ether. She added that such power couldn't possibly be explained by ordinary magic. Ariel's monocle gleamed as she turned, her tone firm but calm, saying she would prefer if Bella didn't investigate further, or mention what she had seen. The younger mage faltered, confused, asking why. Ariel's expression hardened. Scarlet light danced across her palm as she said that if Bella couldn't promise silence, she would be forced to erase her memories. Bella quickly agreed, nervous but resolute, and asked if a magic contract would suffice. Ariel accepted. Runes shimmered between them, quills etched their names, and the pact was sealed. Bella exhaled shakily and asked what they should do next, glancing at the unconscious victims scattered across the floor. She suggested tending to them before anything else. Ariel knelt beside one of the bodies, checked the pulse, and observed that the captives were only under a deep magical sleep. She explained that while they weren't in immediate danger, they should still be transferred to the Academy's medical facilities. With a few practiced gestures, she cast golden barriers around each victim, ensuring their protection for now. Then she turned toward the darkened hallway, announcing that it was time to move deeper into the facility. As they advanced, their footsteps echoed through rows of glass vats and metal instruments. Bella murmured that seeing this place again still felt unreal. Ariel's expression darkened. She said that countless illegal experiments had clearly taken place here, most involving human sacrifice to forge magical catalysts or enhance mana capacity. She frowned, noting that there were no records or evidence of research tied to the Liquidator. Perhaps, she speculated, those studies were conducted elsewhere. Behind them, Gray slowed. Something about this didn't add up. In his past life, this was the site of a catastrophic event that wiped out tens of thousands, but the area now looked too clean, too controlled. He thought that the mere creation of catalysts couldn't have caused such devastation. His eyes dropped to the ground as a memory surfaced. Poisonous miasma rising from beneath the earth. His heart clenched. Could something be hidden below? Ariel noticed his distraction and asked what was wrong. Bella called his name, but Gray remained deep in thought, scanning the floor. He suggested that whatever caused the disaster might lie underground. Ariel narrowed her eyes, studying the cracked tiles. After a moment, she murmured that she couldn't detect any hidden passages. Then her monocle flashed. She moved toward a bloodstained section of floor near a fallen cloak, knelt, and said that she could sense faint traces of short-range teleportation magic. Scarlet symbols pulsed under her fingertips. She theorized that an access point below might only be reachable through teleportation. Judging by the energy residue, she estimated the distance at roughly 300 meters. Gray frowned, asking if that meant something existed far beneath them, and if they could reach it. Ariel said that she could open a similar gate and proposed that they try. She summoned a towering crimson array that spread beneath their feet. As the energy circle stabilized, she explained that if no space existed below, the spell would open only into solid earth. The light pulsed, and then parted. All three leaned forward, breath catching. Far below, an immense chamber unfolded, tiered metallic structures stretching endlessly into darkness. Ariel's voice trembled as she admitted that she never imagined a space this vast existed beneath the lab. Bella gripped her staff tightly, saying that she could feel massive ether currents radiating through the area, particularly from a domed structure near the center. Ariel's gaze sharpened. She sensed something else mingling with the magic. A foreign energy, vast and overwhelming, unlike anything she'd encountered. Sweat trickled down her temple as she confessed that its magnitude was beyond comprehension. Gray's eyes fixed on the dome, and he quietly wondered if the foreign power could be what he feared. Ariel gave a single, grim nod and declared that it was indeed the Liquidator's power. They descended the spiraling steps toward the massive domed structure, the air thick with static hums and violet haze. At the base, a narrow slit of metal gleamed on the curved wall. Gray stepped forward, studying it, and remarked that it looked like a door. His brow furrowed as he tilted his head toward the ceiling, where a stone slab embossed with a sigil hovered above. Again, he muttered, puzzled, that it was a door. Professor Ariel's monocle glinted as her gaze swept across the vast chamber. She murmured thoughtfully, confirming that the power they were tracking was definitely emanating from here. Yet, she added, there was no trace of the Liquidator's presence. Bella, clutching her staff, looked uncertain and asked whether tampering with it was wise. Ariel told her to stay calm, tracing the seam of the metal slit with her fingers. She explained that the door itself held no power. It was merely symbolic, a part of the ritual's outer shell, Casting a quick glance over her shoulder, she asked if they understood what that meant. She paced the chamber's perimeter, eyes darting toward the glowing conduits snaking across the floor and the crystal pylons humming softly. The real energy wasn't in the door, she said, but in the network surrounding it. Violet liquid pulsed through the glass columns, and lightning sparked within. A second later, the runes etched into the floor flared to life, and a blinding red ritual circle blazed open around the central pedestal. Wind tore through the room. Gray shielded his face, shouting in alarm, asking what was happening, and whether Ariel was trying to summon the Liquidator herself. Bella winced, her voice tense as she said the magic felt unstable, urging that they should shut it down before it was too late. Ariel, however, kept her composure, circling the pulsing array. She told them not to interfere, explaining that her calculations showed the structure wasn't capable of summoning the Liquidator. A sharp crack fractured the air. The very fabric of space rippled, forming spiderweb fissures above the circle. Gray looked up, exclaiming that the space was tearing apart. Bella cried out for the professor. But before panic could set in, the tremors ceased. The red light dimmed to a flicker, leaving only a faint hum. Both students caught their breath, exchanging bewildered looks. Ariel's gaze settled on the nearest device, its interior glowing a soft pink. She nodded slowly, as if confirming a theory. She explained that the machines weren't designed to call the Liquidator directly, they merely opened a microscopic tear toward its domain, siphoning the residual power that leaked through. Her eyes drifted upward toward the centerpiece. A crystallized core suspended by chains, faintly pulsing with a sickly light. She added that the core's construction relied on human lives, used as the medium for crystallization. Following her gaze, Gray and Bella stared up at the faceted mass. Ariel assessed its density and concluded that around 10 souls had been consumed so far, though she suspected the real number was much higher. Most of the people they found upstairs, she said grimly, were likely harvested as material. Bella's voice quavered as she asked why anyone would go to such horrific lengths. What purpose could justify it? Ariel folded her arms and said that Bella had already seen the answer. She referenced the black flame Varian had wielded earlier, explaining that the gemstone that powered it was an unfinished prototype of these crystals. Standing beneath the suspended core, Ariel elaborated that the resulting catalyst wouldn't be limited to enhancing flames. If mass-produced, the substance could potentially amplify any form of magic to catastrophic levels. Her gaze drifted back to the door as its cracks sealed shut on their own. Gray realized aloud that Varian's goal had never been to summon the Liquidator at all. Ariel agreed but said she couldn't determine whether he had lacked the means or simply chosen another path. She examined the humming devices, her monocle reflecting their glow, and remarked that the space-rending machinery had already reached its limit. It was likely the cultists could only manage this much with their resources. Bella traced her fingers over a nearby column, marveling at its precision and saying she had never seen spatial warp technology so advanced. She noted that building even one of these constructs would drain an entire nation's treasury, and there were 8 of them here. Ariel's expression darkened as he said that only one institution could afford such an operation. Bella hesitated, suggesting the Disgar Empire, but Ariel dismissed the idea immediately. She explained that while the empire was vast, it lacked the magical research infrastructure to produce even a single device like this. Bella frowned, asking who else could possibly wield such power and resources. Ariel says that it has to be an organization that dwarfs even the empire in magical research. Gray stepped forward between the pillars and said that it could only be the World Union Academy. Bella's eyes widened, but Ariel confirmed it with quiet certainty. She said no other organization had the expertise, funds, or manpower to sustain research of this magnitude. Bella protested, saying the academy was meant to protect humanity from threats, not create them. Ariel said she understood the disbelief but insisted the facts were undeniable. Gray interjected that this didn't mean the entire academy was corrupt. Most of its members likely still fought for humanity's sake. In his mind, he remembered the last days of his previous timeline, when the Academy's elite forces stood at the front lines to defend civilians until their final breath. He couldn't bring himself to see them as humanity's enemies. Ariel gave a slow nod, agreeing that most of the Academy's staff probably acted in good faith, but she added that with such a vast institution, thousands of researchers, hidden departments, and countless facilities. No one could ever grasp the full picture. Whoever backed Varian, she said, had powerful support from within the system. He could never have built all this on his own authority. Bella tightened her grip on her staff, asking if that meant they couldn't trust the Academy completely. Ariel replied that, after decades of service, she knew the Academy well enough to say it wasn't an organization one should blindly rely on. She added that most people inside truly believed they were serving humanity's best interests. Even those behind this experiment might have convinced themselves they were acting for the greater good. The thought lingered coldly among them. Gray asked if there was any way to trace the mastermind. Ariel examined the machines, saying there were no communication tools or magical signatures left behind. The setup had been meticulously scrubbed clean. Finding even a trace would be nearly impossible. She began to add that, besides. The floor shuddered violently, cutting her off. Shockwaves rippled through the chamber as explosions ignited across the perimeter. Fire surged from the conduits, consuming the walls. Gray raised his arm to shield himself, shouting in confusion. Ariel steadied herself against the blast and deduced that the lab had been fitted with self-destruct mechanisms to erase all evidence. She noted that the detonation hadn't triggered immediately upon Varian's death. Perhaps they had intended to lure intruders before setting it off. Bella shouted over the noise that this was no time for theories. They had to escape. Ariel lifted a hand, golden runes swirling beneath their feet, and told her to stay calm. These were only magical explosives, she said, her hair whipping in the heated wind. Her voice cut through the chaos with cold authority as she declared that professors of the World Union Academy were not weak enough to be killed by something like this. As fragments of the dome's ceiling crashed down, Ariel summoned a golden magic circle. She urged her pupils to stay inside her barrier, which stretched wide enough to cover the magic rigs as well. With exact control, she shielded everything and everyone that needed protection. Once she confirmed her targets, she triggered the spell and teleported the whole group out of danger. The professor, Gray, Bella, the rigs, and the unconscious captives rematerialized just outside Varian's bleak laboratory. Some carried injuries that would never fully heal, but every surviving human lab rat made it out alive. Bella finally felt her lungs loosen. Even Gray seemed shaken. He thought that last moment had come far too close to disaster. Because she had to move far more weight than expected, Ariel's teleportation slowed, but she decided it was worth the strain for the rigs alone. With these contrabands on the table, the Academy would no longer be able to look away. The next morning, Ariel brought every piece of information to her superior. World Union Academy's headmaster, Oradram Alexandro, expressed his appreciation for the trio's actions. He said that the survivors were already being treated in the medical wing, and Varian's illicit work had been confirmed and neutralized. As for the magic rigs, he admitted that the situation was trickier. After strict verification, each rig was valued at roughly the same cost as an entire nation's annual budget. Producing 8 of them would drain resources most governments did not even possess. He stated that there was no way Varian alone could ever gather power like that. The headmaster then admitted plainly that the rigs were stolen property. These high-level magic devices had been hijacked during a secured transport. 78 guards had been slaughtered in the incident. Such a horrific casualty count should have shaken the world, yet someone had chosen to bury it. Ariel remembered that 15 years ago, she had heard of an incident that matched this description. The stolen shipment back then had also carried rare engines. Investigators had concluded that the massacre and theft were the work of the Blood Drinker. Headmaster Alexandro noted that everyone should know that name. He said that this group was the largest crime syndicate in the world. He described them as parasites that refused to die, resurfacing again and again no matter how often they were crushed. Bella had studied them in depth. They were the ones who murdered her parents. Their ability to regenerate their ranks made them a constant threat. No one knew where they operated from or who led them. According to rumors, over 70% of crime-related deaths could be traced back to them in some form. It would not be unreasonable, Alexandro explained, to assume that some of their agents had already infiltrated the Academy. He added that there was no reliable way to identify them. Even if there were, he said that the Academy would refuse to act. Hearing that from the headmaster himself made Gray bristle with anger. Ariel admitted that the Academy's creed created situations like this. Anyone with talent was welcomed, regardless of race, background, gender, or affiliation. She said that as long as a student could become exceptional, their criminal tendencies were treated as irrelevant. Bella protested that criminals should be confronted, not groomed. Alexandro agreed wholeheartedly. He said that the problem was the higher authorities who disagreed. He explained that although he held the title of headmaster, he was little more than a subordinate in the larger hierarchy. On paper he was the academy's leader, but in truth his authority was almost meaningless. He told Gray and Bella that if they wanted to learn who really controlled this place, they first needed to rise in strength. The stronger and more promising they became, the deeper they would be allowed into the academy's inner circles and the more secrets they would hear. He could not reveal names, but he hinted that one upperclassman had enough influence to steer the entire academy's policies. He said that this student helped create the system that welcomed talented criminals. If Gray could someday surpass that upperclassman, then he could also reshape the academy itself. Here, strength decided everything. Hearing that gave both Divine Eye students a renewed sense of purpose. Still, Alexandro had one last question he held back. He knew that Ariel could not match Varian in combat at all, which meant one of the two students managed to cross an enormous gulf in power to defeat a professor. Ariel's Divine Eye had sharpened this year, and he said he was eager to see what kind of monster her program would eventually forge. After the meeting, Gray walked down a long hallway, lost in thought. He looked at the arm holding his strange power and wondered what strength truly meant. If he wanted to uncover the Academy's hidden truths and someday change history itself, he needed to grow far stronger. He told himself that his focus had to shift entirely toward improvement. While he imagined how his future might unfold, someone slammed into him. Snapped out of his thoughts, he looked up just in time to see a shoe swinging down toward his face. With no time to dodge, he raised his arms on instinct. The kick launched him several feet back. Pain shot through his forearm where he had blocked the blow. The attacker clicked his tongue and muttered that Gray was tougher than he expected. When Gray confronted him, the stranger acted offended. He had dark circles under lifeless eyes and an emo-styled haircut. He complained that Gray walked around as if he owned the place, even though he was nothing more than a special admission reject. Gray realized this was just another entitled student who resented the special program, though this was the first time someone actually struck him. Gray gripped his blade, ready to retaliate. Emo braced himself as well, but then the second, reject, appeared. He meant Professor Ariel. The emo coward turned and walked off before she could intervene. Once far enough away, he muttered angrily to himself, apologizing for failing to get close to the target. He bit his thumb until blood flowed, seething. He swore quietly that he would send that reject to the afterlife to join Professor Varian when the moment came. When Ariel reached Gray, she asked what had just happened. Gray explained that some random punk had kicked him for no reason other than walking through the halls. Since no weapons were used and no serious injuries occurred, she told him she could not take official action. Even so, she said he had full permission to chase the guy down and beat the lights out of him if he wanted. She admitted she should not say things like that, but she could always blame her fading eyesight if questioned. Gray did not want to stir up more trouble, so he chose to let it go. The troublesome professor sighed in disappointment. Since they were already on the topic of discrimination, she asked him what it was like to be part of her Divine Eye program. Gray said that insults and rude comments were normal, but this was the first time someone had gotten physical. Hearing what her students endured, Ariel apologized repeatedly for her lack of influence. Gray reminded her that he would not have been admitted at all without her help. He added that he believed Bella and the others would soon prove the program was no mistake. He said he trusted her judgment completely, since all the students she handpicked became respected heroes. His words eased her guilt. She said she was glad he believed in her ability, then told him to toughen up. Among everyone in the Divine Eye group, she said she expected the most from him. Amy White, Leek Muller, and Jacob Bloomfield, the previous special admissions, were destined for greatness. But Gray made her believe someone could surpass ordinary limits entirely. Being compared to future legends made Gray uneasy, but her confidence warmed him. Meanwhile, the mastermind behind Varian's work still lurked somewhere, plotting to summon the Liquidator. Compared to that being, the heroes Gray admired were insignificant. That was why he returned to the past to begin with. He intended to change the world's fate. After dealing with criminals and war crimes, he now had to return to normal student life. He reminded himself that he was still just a student. Today's swordsmanship class required live combat practice. The professor assigned partners based on the list on the board. Practical training here was brutal. Gray focused. If he failed, everyone would use it as fuel to mock the divine eye again. At minimum, he needed to match the class average. Sadly, his opponent made that unlikely. He had been paired with the freshman representative, Leonard Apius. This knockoff Lloyd Forger was currently the top student in swordsmanship. The professor told the class that partners were matched by skill level, so no one should hold back. They were to treat the practice as a real fight. Gray silently cursed the professor for making his day miserable. He knew Leon despised Divine Eye students. The guy was probably eager to beat him senseless after their encounter in magic class. Right on cue, Leon grabbed him by the shoulder. Gray froze. He had no idea that Blondie was thrilled to spar with his new idol. Leon had trained twice as hard as his peers because he wanted to show Lord Gray his sword. Seeing that bright, almost drunk smile, Gray was unsure whether to laugh, panic, or run. He interpreted the look as someone excited to beat a classmate legally. After everyone found their partner, the professor gave the signal to begin. Right away, the sound of steel slamming against steel filled the Colosseum. Leonard charged the instant the match began, sprinting with bullet-like speed. Gray barely managed to lift his blade in time, catching the fierce opening strike. Leon overpowered the block with ease and shoved him back across the stone floor. Blondie pressed forward without giving him a breath. Gray tried to answer with a counter, but Leon's flawless technique shut him down every time. From that brief metallic exchange, Leon openly remarked that Gray's strength impressed him. He said it made no sense that Gray failed regular admission. With their first impressions set, both fighters ramped up their speed. Gray expected to get flattened instantly, but somehow he kept pace. In raw strength, he was completely outclassed. In technique, Leon's polished style embodied the exact definition of perfect textbook swordsmanship pushed to frightening heights. Even with his past life's hard-earned experience and his master's ruthless training, Gray was barely hanging on. Leonard Apius was simply one of those natural-born monsters backed by relentless discipline. As their duel reached its peak, nearly everyone else stopped fighting to watch. Students whispered in surprise when they realized the Divine Eye Kid was matching their number one. Leon looked thrilled. He seemed ready to keep swinging until nightfall. Gray, on the other hand, felt his stamina slipping fast. He silently thanked Professor Heathcote because without that brutal training, he would have collapsed several exchanges ago. Leon didn't even look winded. If this turned into a drawn-out fight, Gray knew he would lose. Thankfully, the professor told them to treat the practical as a real battle, which meant nothing limited them to formal swordplay. When Leon swung with enough intent to split him, Gray dropped into a bizarre stance to slip under the strike. He was practically face down with his rear up. Planting his palm, he pivoted his entire body across the floor. The unorthodox movement caught Leon completely off guard. Instead of trying to win a losing contest in pure swordplay, Gray switched tactics and used his legs to disrupt Leon's balance. He literally swept Blondie off his feet. With Leon floating midair, Gray moved in to capitalize. When their eyes met, Leon finally understood what the professor meant about treating this spar like a real fight for survival. Even falling backward, he refused to let himself lose. In the end, both blades halted inches from each other's throats. Gray stood upright, while Leon had managed to counter from the ground. Gray extended a hand and declared the match a draw. Leon accepted the hand but rejected the draw. He explained that in that final moment, he had only swung on instinct, while Gray had a clear chance to stab him straight through the heart if he wished. Since this was still practice, Gray had shifted his strike out of caution. Saying this with an honest smile, Leon conceded defeat. He added that the exchange taught him the difference between real combat and simple fencing drills. Gray felt guilty about using a trick move in sword class, but Leon insisted that real fights had no rules. He said there was no such thing as cheating when your life was on the line. Then he politely asked for another round. Gray hesitated. His win relied entirely on the surprise of that pivot, and now that Leon had seen it, the odds were stacked heavily against him. Even without counting technique, the stamina gap was simply too massive. Before Gray could refuse, a random NPC stepped into their conversation. The boy claimed that sword class was meant to showcase technique, not trickery. In truth, he seemed bitter that the special admit failure got paired with the top student. Gray already felt his patience thinning. Thankfully, Leon cut in and defended Gray, telling the NPC to get lost. The professor backed him up, explaining that the pairings were based on total capability, and Gray was the only one who could push Leon. If anyone disagreed, the professor said they were welcome to challenge Gray. If they beat him, they could fight Leon next. NPC boy looked ready to explode. He bragged about beating the entrance examiner and said he refused to be compared to weaklings or failures. Leon scoffed and said the logic reminded him of his old self. He said this interruption was the perfect chance for Gray to show strength worth acknowledging. Still, he was quietly furious that nobody wasted valuable time he could have spent training with Lord Gray. When the NPC glanced behind Gray and saw Leon grinding his teeth, he had no clue he was only alive because Leon was restraining himself. Since the salty challenger insisted that unorthodox moves were unfair, Gray agreed to use only swordsmanship. He did not know how strong this guy was, but anyone who passed the exam with high marks should be competent. Judging from his build, the NPC probably had more stamina and physical strength. Gray reminded himself that his master's rough training could not match years of careful conditioning. He also asked the professor whether there were hidden stakes. The professor said it was just a casual bout with no consequences, though he encouraged both fighters to go all out. With the rules set, the two raised their blades. When the signal sounded, NPC boy bolted forward like a madman. He already imagined himself rising to glory by putting the special admit in his place. To test him, Gray received the first hit directly with a clean block. The result surprised him. The loudmouth had noodle arms. As NPC boy stumbled in confusion, Gray was already planning his counter. The challenger scrambled upright and pretended nothing happened, launching another attack. Gray wondered if he was holding back or simply awful. His thoughts drifted just long enough that he misjudged the depth of his next strike. In one motion, he drew blood and left a mark that would stick with the NPC for life. With the challenger crawling on the floor, the professor prepared to end the match. Gray immediately felt bad for hitting too hard. He said he only meant to disarm him, but the NPC had just stood there and let himself get stabbed. Tears ran down the boy's face as he demanded a rematch. He insisted he had slipped and that the loss was a fluke. The professor felt so sorry for him that he allowed several more rounds until the message finally sank in. Minutes later, Gray lowered his sword out of pity. NPC boy had been crushed so thoroughly that he looked nothing like his earlier self. His face was swollen beyond recognition, and the students avoided looking at him. The professor asked a few students to drag the poor guy to the infirmary. With the drama wrapped up, the freshman representatives were chosen. As expected, Gray and Leon earned the spots. After witnessing earlier events, no one dared object. Not knowing the academy's customs, Gray asked what being a representative meant. Leon explained that the top first years had to challenge the second-year champion in the inter-year battle. In the last 35 years, first years held a perfect record of 0-35, an unbroken streak of losing. The professor said he had a feeling this year might finally be different. 3.5 decades of complete domination showed a massive gap in power. Surviving even 1 year in this academy changed people. Losing to upperclassmen had become routine. If a freshman put up a decent fight, that alone was impressive. A victory would become legend. Leon said that being selected was an honor, and they both carried that responsibility. Since few expected a win anyway, the pressure was lighter than Gray imagined. Still, this was his chance to show that a Divine Eye student could stand with the best. In the days that followed, he trained relentlessly. Meanwhile, under the headmaster's leadership, the Academy's faculty meeting addressed Professor Boudreau's new proposal. Resembling the pot of greed, the magic professor suggested removing the Divine Eye student Amy White. Ariel objected immediately. She reminded them that she was responsible for her students, and that outsiders should not interfere. Boudreau argued that Amy failed the third-year advancement exam and should be expelled like everyone else who failed. He called it unfair that she was allowed to remain. Ariel repeated what she had already explained countless times. Amy was on track to become a world-class fighter. She suffered a severe backlash and temporarily lost access to her full strength. If healthy, she would have passed that exam without effort. Boudreaux dismissed the explanation outright. Several other professors echoed him. They claimed anyone could invent the story of a hidden prodigy, but without evidence it meant nothing. Ariel insisted that Amy was close to regaining control of her power, maybe even the next day. If they forced her now, that chance might vanish forever. The Magic Department coalition continued pressing her, framing themselves as defenders of the Academy's standards. Ariel reminded them that the Academy existed to nurture exceptional talent. Expelling someone gifted simply because they didn't fit the mold betrayed that purpose. With a smug grin, Boudreaux claimed that the special admissions were declining in quality and called the current batch failures. He listed Amy White, Bella Albright, and Jacob Bloomfield, saying all of them came with baggage. He suggested that perhaps Ariel's divine eye was going dull and that it was time to scrap the program entirely. Ariel had grown used to these men ganging up on her, but they had never dared to go this far. Boudreaux went on to explain that the Divine Eye program had been created by the Academy's Founders Council, so if they held a vote and at least half the faculty agreed to his proposal, the result should be treated as absolute. He claims that, given the disappointing performance of the current Divine Eye batch, a large portion of the staff is already leaning his way. Many acknowledged hearing rumors about Bella's growth, but they say that her progress is negligible when her still shaky mana capacity is taken into account. They admit that the earlier generations of Divine Eye students were legendary figures. The current group, they say, looks pathetic in comparison. Judging from the sly glances circling the round table, it becomes clear that this meeting has been orchestrated specifically to corner Professor Ariel. She realizes that there are far more outspoken anti-Divine Eye voices than she had anticipated. At this rate, they might secure enough support to gut the program entirely. With that ugly Boudreaux at the forefront, they like to believe that they are bravely reforming an outdated system. In reality, they simply cannot stand the idea that someone else might possess a sharper eye for talent than they do. Ariel wants nothing more than to stand up and fight for her students, but she understands that anything she says now could be twisted and used against her. A loud majority already despises her. Even so, a fair number of professors still care primarily about whether a program benefits the Academy as a whole. If she hopes to sway them, she must tread carefully and remain as inoffensive as possible. Boudreaux savors the sight of Ariel falling silent and continues needling her with spiteful remarks. He condescendingly acknowledges her past merits and, in the very next breath, suggests that she ought to retire gracefully before she tarnishes her own legacy further. Some hostile faculty members even propose that she should open her own academy if she refuses to part with her precious failures. The blatant jab sends Boudreaux and his cronies into roaring laughter. Ariel swallows the humiliation for her students' sake, determined to buy them a little more time. She truly believes that all they need is patience and proper support to bloom into something extraordinary. If she can keep them from being expelled until that moment, she will consider it a major victory. While the faculty is still on the subject of Divine Eye pupils, one of the old men brings up Gray's name. He notes that the boy is already being praised as a standout freshman in swordsmanship. The news that a Divine Eye reject has been chosen for the inter-year battle makes Boudreaux sit up with renewed interest. He confidently suggests that they should decide the Divine Eye program's fate based solely on the result of this year's inter-year match. Ariel darts a quick look toward Heathcote. The steadfast trainer shakes his head, clearly disapproving of the idea. She argues that Gray is not suited to light-hearted duels and mock combat. She insists that he is a lethal weapon meant only for genuine life or death situations. One of the elderly professors slams his fist on the table and accuses her of piling on excuses. He declares that any skill that fails to appear in practice will be useless in true battle as well. Losing ground in the discussion, Ariel tries to explain that Gray's abilities simply do not fit within normal metrics. Before the argument boils over, the headmaster calls for quiet and moves to close out the meeting. Curious about Gray's abilities himself, the headmaster says that he supports the idea of having every professor attend the inter-year battle to see the boy in action before making a final decision. Ariel is horrified, but the session is adjourned. One by one, the other professors file out with visible satisfaction, leaving her slumped and drained in her chair. Heathcote worries about his friend. Ariel trembles as she silently apologizes to her students in her heart. She has already seen how terrifying Gray can be when he fully unleashes his power. But she also knows that he still needs time to build a solid foundation. At this point, All she can do is place her hopes and dreams on the shoulders of her youngest prodigy. It will be up to Gray to safeguard the future of the Divine Eye program. The day of the inter-year battle finally arrives, and the entire academy crowds into the Colosseum for the grand tradition. First, the announcer introduces the participants. The poster boy of noble swordsmanship, freshman top student Leonard Apius, steps forward to a roar of applause. On the opposite side stands Luanil Hartman, the Academy's top-performing second year. When Gray Lee is announced as the first-year challenger, the reaction is noticeably cooler compared to the Golden Boys. As for the second-year challenger, Gray instantly recognizes the sharp-eyed emo who ambushed him in the hallway not long ago. Deeble Radartle. He privately notes that fate has handed him the perfect chance to return the favor in front of everyone. The host runs through formal introductions and flowery hype, while a thick tension settles over one section of the viewing stands. Professors from many departments have turned up to witness this year's clash. At their head is Professor Boudreaux, wearing a smug grin and straining the buttons on his shirt. Leon notices the unusually high number of staff present. Luanil also remarks that the turnout is bizarre. He says that last year, only 3 fencing instructors even bothered to come. Scanning the full row of dignified faculty members, Leon finally pieces it together. He concludes that they all carved time out of their schedules because they are curious about Gray. Luanil finds Leon's excitement strange, saying that the blonde never used to act like this. Boudreaux openly admits that they all gathered here specifically to watch Gray and witness what he calls the Divine Eye program's final stand. That revelation sends a ripple of whispers through the student seats, many of whom only came in hopes of seeing blood. Completely unaware of the previous faculty meeting, Gray asks what Boudreaux means by that. Boudreaux seems delighted that the boy has not been told about the political weight on his shoulders. He announces with theatrical confidence that the Divine Eye class is being abolished, crushed, and erased from the academy. Gray immediately looks to Professor Ariel for confirmation, but her stricken expression is answer enough. She had purposely chosen not to tell him the truth, knowing that he would push himself to reckless extremes. She fears that he would risk tapping into that destructive power again. Without the proper preparation and rest, she worries that the strain could kill him. Instead of collapsing, Ariel forces herself to smile and cheer him on. She claims that Boudreaux is merely trying to rattle him with cheap mind games. Her words sound strong and steady, but the trembling of her hand betrays her fear. Gray decides to honor her attempt to shield him from the pressure, yet that does not mean he plans to hold back. In fact, he quietly resolves to go all out. Boudreaux pouts when his taunts fail to provoke visible panic, but he is clearly eager to watch the freshman embarrass himself. He expects Gray to lose so badly that any undecided professors will finally abandon Ariel's Divine Eye as a useless relic. Since the pompous pig on the balcony refuses to shut up, Gray finally raises his voice. He says that he cannot let blatant insults toward his mentor go unanswered. He does not care what Boudreaux says about him personally. He says that slandering Professor Ariel's judgment is an unforgivable sin. Hearing Gray defend her hits Ariel right in the chest. Boudreaux only scoffs and throws a few lazy insults back, clearly lacking creativity. Gray quietly swears that by the day's end, he will prove Boudreaux wrong. The fat professor loves hurling mockery, but he can never handle it when things do not go his way. The referee steps into the arena and instructs the fighters to separate into their designated corners. Ariel appreciates Gray's composure, but she has no idea what he is planning. She thinks that if he had been matched with the top student Luanil, his irregular, practical sword style might have given him a slim advantage. Instead, he has drawn a nightmare opponent. Deeble Radartle is a strange case. Rumor has it that Professor Varian Bradley personally tampered with the boy's brain, reshaping his reflexes to inhuman speed and turning him into a walking weapon. From Ariel's perspective, this is the worst possible matchup for Gray's sneaky ambush tactics. She thinks that he might have a chance if he resorts to that double-edged technique, but her conscience will not survive the risk if something happens to him. Before the event began, she reassured him that he did not need to worry about her or the program. Gray answered with a confident, wordless smile. The first bout on the schedule is the top student match. Both representatives step forward when called. The arena is already layered with protective wards to prevent fatal injury. Triggering an opponent's safeguard barrier will count as victory, so the fighters are free to move as if they are in a real death match. With all preparations finished, the inter-year bottle's top student showdown officially begins. Leon tried to seize control of the tempo from the opening second, charging in with a roar. Luanil welcomed the aggression, saying that he wanted to test the waters before deciding how seriously to fight. When Leon closed the distance, he unleashed a barrage of sharp, rapid slashes. As his tempo began to wane, Luanil saw the perfect opening. He swung a brutal decapitating strike that hummed through the air but narrowly missed its target. Leon dropped low and used his hand as a pivot point to twist out of danger, visibly copying the move Gray used on him days earlier. Instead of relying on his rigid, predictable style, he tried to evolve and incorporate trickier options. But he wasn't Lord Gray. He lacked the timing and confidence needed to land something that bold. Luanil countered cleanly and clipped him on the head, minimizing the damage but proving the point. He remarked that Leon had grown far stronger than he was as a first year, but said it was time to show the boy how much a single year at the academy could change someone. Then he surged forward with a smile, overwhelming his junior with relentless pace. Leon was pushed to the arena's edge with no room left to retreat. Luanil lunged like a predator closing in on a trapped animal. His sword connected with the protective magic before the blade could slice through Leon's throat. As expected, the second-year ace, Luanil Hartman, claimed victory. Humble in defeat, Leon thanked his senior for the intense match. The referee wasted no time and announced the challenger bout next. Passing Gray, Leon wished him sincere luck, explaining that he believed in him completely. Gray had already spoken boldly before the match, so failing to deliver would be humiliating. But compared to the horrors he'd already faced before turning back time, fighting one emo psycho felt trivial. The Liquidator, the Apocalypse, the collapse of the world. Those were real opponents. This kid was not. Across the arena, Deeble dragged his blade along the ground, whispering warped prayers to the dead Professor Varian Bradley. He was eager, ecstatic even, to send Varian's killer down to hell for a bloody reunion. With that, the challenger match officially began. Gray stood firm, focused, and properly grounded. Deeble, by contrast, carried the chaotic air of someone unpredictable and unstable. As they sized each other up, the entire Colosseum fell silent. Once the signal rang, Gray struck first, forcing Deeble back with a full-powered blow. But to his shock, the hit felt useless. Deeble batted him away with a lazy swing that packed monstrous power. The counterstrike rattled Gray's dominant arm until it trembled. Ariel had warned him about Deeble's enhanced reflexes. But the kid's arm strength felt amplified too, as if Varian had tampered with more than just the brain. With such a huge gap in raw power, clever tricks meant nothing. Gray's mind jumped straight to the forbidden option. But Ariel had already told him that using that power was off limits. She said that even in the worst scenario, he must not activate it. The cost could be death, and there was no coming back from that. She reminded him that no tournament was worth his life. She also noted that the arena's barrier would never survive the impact, which meant his attack might kill classmates and spectators along with his opponent. Gray wanted desperately to protect Ariel and the Divine Eye program, but he couldn't justify killing a fellow student, no matter how unhinged. Deeble soon flipped the momentum, going on the offensive and forcing Gray into a defensive scramble. Each of Deeble's swings carried shocking force, yet his movements looked oddly stiff and mechanical. With reflexes and strength this high, Deeble should have been able to toy with Gray. His technique clearly wasn't lacking, so there was only one explanation. He was holding back for a reason. His eyes revealed that he was planning something wrong. A wave of dread hit Gray's gut. He stumbled back, barely dodging a clean vertical strike. Suspended midair, off balance, he watched the tip of Deeble's blade race toward his vitals. Knowing he couldn't dodge, he braced for a desperate block. Somehow it worked. He absolutely should have died, yet he survived. It became clear that Deeble had intentionally weakened the blow. Ariel shot to her feet, panic flooding her expression. She activated her Divine Eye for a closer look, only to find something horrifying in Deeble's chest. Where a heart should have been, a foreign object pulsed with malevolent energy. Before she could process it, Boudreaux's obnoxious voice cut in, demanding her attention. His group of yes-men joked that Deeble was simply toying with Gray, saying that the boy couldn't even handle sloppy swings. They claimed this was all the proof needed that Divine Eye students were frauds. Laughter erupted from their section while the fight unfolded beneath them. Ariel finally stepped forward and announced that the fight needed to stop immediately. Boudreaux accused her of fabricating excuses to avoid letting Gray expose his own mediocrity. He argued that the barrier was perfectly safe and that lethal attacks would always be blocked. He said their magic tech had kept students safe for years. Ariel knew all of that. She also knew that this situation was different. Just as she began shouting about the danger, a surge of murderous intent flooded the arena. Deeble stopped playing and tapped into the corrupted heart in his chest. Ariel had seen monsters before, but the look on that boy's face made her blood run cold. Channeling the vile energy into his blade, Deeble unleashed a single strike that cut through everything. The attack tore forward unopposed. When the dust cleared, the arena floor had been sliced nearly in half. Even the Academy's prized protection barrier had been carved apart like paper. Boudreaux's smugness evaporated instantly. None of the staff, even the experts, had expected the barrier to fail, except Ariel. She summoned binding ropes with shaking hands, cursing Varian for being a headache even in death, but when she tried to seal the mutated heart's energy, the reflective properties repelled her spell. Thinking fast, she ordered the magic department to shut down the entire barrier system immediately. The tournament was over. This wasn't swordsmanship anymore, this was attempted murder. The professors assigned to maintain the barrier were frozen in terror. Realizing she couldn't rely on them, Ariel screamed at Gray to run. But escape was no longer an option. Turning his back even once meant instant death. The spectators were blinded by the blast's flash and overwhelmed by the pressure in the air. Heathcote calculated roughly 30 seconds before Ariel's repair spell would reach the battlefield. They couldn't wait that long. He gave Gray a subtle signal, their trump card. Earlier, he had drilled the idea into Gray's head. He needed to think of his body as the sword. Swinging a weapon alone was beginner stuff. True mastery required merging movement, mind, and blade into a single unified strike. It was simple in theory, but brutally difficult in practice. Still, if Heathcote believed he was ready, Gray would trust him. He had no other options anyway. Centering himself, Gray fused his focus with his weapon. Deeble launched another deranged attack, slicing the ground apart. The chaos-infused blade clashed with the crippled barrier and erupted into an explosion that obscured everything. When the haze cleared, Gray was gone, completely untouched. Tapping into a dormant instinct buried deep inside, he vanished and reappeared behind Deeble in the blink of an eye. For the first time all battle, Deeble looked afraid. As Deeble slowly turned his head, Gray felt the world stretch into slow motion. It wasn't that Deeble had slowed down. Gray had simply become much, much faster. Gray's blade slammed into Deeble's protective barrier and halted with a sharp jolt, but he refused to let the clash end there. He forced more strength into the strike until cracks shimmered across the surface. A heartbeat later, the barrier shattered in a piercing burst, the shockwave launching Deeble across the arena and into the far wall with a crash that shook dust from the rafters. When the rubble settled, a gaping hole remained, but Deeble was not inside it. Several professors gasped that Gray had just destroyed an active defense barrier, unable to process what they had witnessed. Heathcote demanded to know if the student was still alive as staff sprinted toward the breach. Before anyone reached it, a hand gripped the broken edge. Deeble pulled himself out, dark energy spilling from him in a heavier, more ominous wave. Heathcote stiffened, instinctively sensing danger as Deeble stepped forward, sword in hand, expression vacant and feral. The professors stared at his unharmed form in disbelief. Ariel recovered first, urging Gray to stay alert. Gray answered with focused determination, but his expression shifted when Deeble's aura thickened. Without warning, Deeble launched dark energy slashes from across the arena, each one sharp enough to carve through stone. Gray dodged in rapid succession, frustration tightening his breath as the attacks intensified, shaking the entire Colosseum. Students cried out in panic. Professors struggled to understand what they were seeing. Ariel shouted at the team handling the audience barrier, asking why it remained active, and they called back that they needed 10 more seconds. Meanwhile, Gray fought alone through the barrage, unable to counter. Through a brief opening, he locked eyes with Deeble. In that exact instant, Deeble appeared before him, blade aimed for a killing thrust. Gray reacted on instinct, raising his sword just in time. The clash sent a violent tremor through his arms. Studying Deeble up close, he realized the boy's strength and speed far exceeded human limits. Yet he also knew he himself was not normal while channeling this power. He vanished from the lock and reappeared behind Deeble, body bent for a decisive strike. Before he could complete it, the backlash of his power hammered him. Blood burst from his eyes and mouth, his muscles seizing. Ariel shot to her feet, terror breaking her voice. Gray forced himself upright, refusing to fall. He told himself that if he failed to counter now, he was finished. He drove his foot into the ground, reached deeper for power, and his eyes flared a fierce red. Then the strike landed. When the motion ended, Deeble's arms were severed, tumbling through the air. Dark ether spewed from the stumps like smoke as Deeble collapsed to his knees, screaming. Gray remained in his finishing stance, expression empty. The entire arena fell silent as the audience barrier finally flickered off. Ariel broke the stillness by giving orders, and dozens of professors sprinted forward and wrapped Deeble in multiple layers of binding spellwork. Gray stood trembling, using his sword as support, breath ragged. Then the recoil surged again, harder. His head pounded, vision hollowing out. Fresh wounds tore open across his skin, blood bursting forth in thin, violent streams. He collapsed just as Ariel reached him. She dropped to her knees, frantic, flooding him with healing magic. Other professors surrounded her and assisted, forming several glowing circles that sealed his injuries and steadied his breathing. Warmth washed over him as consciousness flickered. Finally, Ariel exhaled in shaky relief. But when she lifted her head, someone stood in front of her. Gray. Upright. Smiling faintly. He thanked her, and the professors sputtered in disbelief, asking if he was truly all right. Ariel rose slowly and studied him through her activated divine eye. Her brows lifted. His soul was untouched, perfectly intact. Not even a trace of damage remained. Gray relaxed, sheathing his sword and asking about his condition. Ariel explained that the restorative magic handled everything. Heathkit approached, remarking that the reduced backlash method seemed to have worked. Ariel turned on him, furious, demanding to know how this bloody collapse counted as reduced. She warned that without healing magic, Gray might have died. Heathkit admitted that they aimed to limit the recoil to injuries magic could mend, saying it was good enough for now and that eventually Gray needed to withstand the backlash unaided. Gray listened uneasily, realizing exactly what his brutal training had been preparing him for. Later, as staff cleaned the ruined arena and medics carried Deeble away, Ariel exhaled and said that although much had strayed from expectations, one final matter had to be addressed. She turned to the headmaster and asked who won. The headmaster recalled that Deeble's protection field had triggered mid-strike, meaning the victory went to Gray. The announcement sent the first years into uproarious cheers. They marveled aloud that Gray, a Divine Eye student, had defeated a second year. Leon shouted proudly that this was exactly what he expected of him. Heathkit observed that Gray had ended the first year's 35-match losing streak. Then he added that after witnessing this, win-loss records no longer mattered. He asked the faculty if any of them could still claim Ariel's judgment was flawed. The headmaster agreed easily, saying no one would support abolishing the Divine Eye program after what they had just seen. Another professor admitted embarrassment for ever doubting it, noting they had almost expelled a prodigy. Professors clustered around Gray, praising him. Ariel remained quiet, tears sliding down her cheek as she clutched her arm, silently thanking him. Then one professor added that those who insisted on abolishing the Divine Eye program should reflect on the consequences of their actions. Instantly, every gaze turned toward Budra and the two men beside him. Cold sweat trickled down their faces as they shrank under the faculty's silent judgment, Budra scrambling for words as dread settled heavily across him. Professor Boudreau hastily claimed that he had other preparations to take care of and quickly made his escape. His attendants hurried after him without hesitation. The remaining professors laughed openly as the group retreated. One of the older professors remarked that the old saying about never picking a fight with the Divine Eye still rang true. Another professor nearby added that, compared to the past, Professor Ariel had clearly mellowed. Time had changed many things since those days. Gray found himself wondering what might have happened to her back then. Once the disturbance had passed, Headmaster Alexandro approached Gray to discuss several matters that troubled him. His expression was grave. Gray stayed alert as he asked what the issue was. Alexandro explained that during the match, the second-year representative, Deeble Ritterdal, had been forcibly infused with an unnatural power. The Academy intended to investigate the matter thoroughly. He added that a mock battle should have been completely safe, yet it had nearly cost a student his life. Because of that failure, the headmaster stated that the Academy bore full responsibility for not detecting the anomaly in advance, and he offered his apology. Gray responded that it was unnecessary since nothing catastrophic had happened in the end, and he thanked him regardless. Alexandro then mentioned that after Ritterdal went berserk, Gray himself had released a strange power. Hearing this made Gray tense. The headmaster clarified that he knew it was not magic, but something far more unusual. It was a kind of power that modern magical theory could not even begin to explain. Alexandro said that he wanted to know what that power truly was. Gray found himself at a loss for words. He could not speak of anything related to his regression, especially when the mastermind behind the Liquidator remained hidden. So he replied that he genuinely did not know. Alexandro expressed doubt, pointing out that Gray had used the power directly. Gray said that he had not known such a power existed within him, and that Professor Ariel was the one who noticed it and explained it to him afterward. Professor Ariel, however, knew this was untrue. By the time Gray had defeated the Ogre General, he had already been wielding that power with ease. It made her question what he was truly planning. Deep down, Gray hoped she would play along. To stop the Liquidator, he needed her to remain the one holding authority. She quickly realized what he was aiming for. She was impressed that he had considered everything so carefully. It made her suspect that he was not living life as someone experiencing it for the first time. She could sense how deeply he trusted her, and that left her with no choice but to support him. She stepped into the conversation and told the headmaster that he was correct in saying Gray's power could not be analyzed through magic theory. However, she added that she could perceive it clearly with her eyes. She explained that after observing his power, she consulted Professor Heathcote, who had a strong affinity for it, and that cooperation made Gray's level of control that day possible. She admitted that she was still researching the proper way to draw out the power, but she asked if the headmaster would entrust everything related to Gray's power to her. After witnessing the fight, he said that he could not refuse. He declared that Gray and the entire Divine Eye Special Group were under her command, and he encouraged her to inform him if the Academy could provide any assistance. Neither of them had expected that response. She thanked him sincerely, and Gray exchanged a quiet smile with Professor Ariel. Afterward, the headmaster headed toward the special underground medical ward to examine Ritterdal's condition. He stated that he would need her eyes to accompany him, and she replied that it would be her pleasure. Later, she returned to her office and marked the door with an eye. Taking a sip of her tea, she informed Gray that the analysis results showed the power used on Ritterdal was almost identical to the Liquidator's. She was certain that crystals from the research facility had been involved. Gray asked what had happened to Ritterdal. She replied that, unfortunately, he had died. Gray was about to ask whether he was responsible, but before he could finish, she told him that he was not. She explained that the moment the power activated, Ritterdal ceased to be himself. He might have already been gone by the time the power was implanted, and it was clear that the attack had been aimed at Gray as retaliation for killing Varian Bradley. The revelation left Gray feeling heavy and subdued. He also realized that if Ritterdal had been tampered with after Varian's death, then a third party must have been involved. She added that she could sense a much bigger force hiding behind everything. She said that she planned to continue tracing the connections, though it would take time. Her intuition suggested that deeper parts of the Academy were involved. Gray said that he understood and asked her to let him know if there was anything he could help with. She thanked him earnestly. She also mentioned that she had noticed he had learned to use his power without damaging his soul. Gray agreed, though he admitted that the physical backlash this time had been worse than before. Her silence puzzled him. Then she revealed that Heathcote had determined it was time for Gray's training to advance to the next stage. The news filled him with excitement. He asked if that was truly the case. She confirmed it with a smile and declared that he would soon learn to control his power far better than he could now. An armored figure stood beneath the open sky. At the center of the field, surrounded by still armored training dummies, stood a lone swordsman. That swordsman was Gray. Professor Heathcote, watching from a distance, stated that the training method was both dangerous and extremely painful. He warned that there were safer alternatives if Gray was willing to take more time, and he asked whether Gray was absolutely certain. Gray answered simply that he was. With that, the training began. Gray closed his eyes and concentrated. He pictured himself as a single blade and tried to recall the sensation from before. A black mist coiled around his sword, gradually transforming into red energy. That same energy spread across his body. Once it settled, he was ready. Gray swung his sword in one clean motion, and the red energy tore through the armored dummies, shattering them instantly. The crimson slash ripped onward, sending fragments flying through the air. He dashed across the field, striking in every direction as more dummies were destroyed. When the rampage ended, Gray burst out from the center, leaving only wreckage behind him. The professors were stunned by his speed. They could hardly believe what they had seen, yet admiration was clear on their faces. Professor Heathcote, however, frowned slightly as his brows drew together. Gray charged toward the opposite side of the training ground. The moment he pushed himself to continue, blood suddenly burst from several parts of his body. He glanced over his shoulder and swung his sword toward the armored dummies behind him. His steps faltered, and he collapsed face first onto the ground. The professors in white robes stationed nearby reacted instantly, activating recovery magic. A green mist enveloped Gray's body as the spell took effect. He remained unconscious for a short while. After a few moments, however, the wounds had fully closed, and he managed to stand back up. He expressed his thanks to everyone who had helped him. Professor Heathcote stated that Gray had made noticeable progress. He said that Gray was able to maintain the state longer than during the previous attempt. He believed that with repeated training, Gray's body would slowly adapt and learn to withstand the backlash. Gray admitted that he had not noticed the damage at the time because his focus had been absolute. Now, however, he understood just how painful using that power truly was. Professor Heathcote approached him and explained that pain and suffering were signs that Gray was pushing beyond his limits. At the same time, he acknowledged that the training itself was extreme. Whether Gray chose to continue or stop was entirely his decision. Gray stated firmly that he wanted to keep going. He shifted back into a combat stance, preparing for another attempt. Before he could move, someone arrived and ordered them to stop. It was Professor Ariel. She reminded them that the training was restricted to once per day. Gray argued that his body had already been healed, and because of that, his soul would not suffer damage. She replied that physical wounds could indeed be treated with recovery magic. However, she warned that if he continued to strain himself before fully stabilizing, his senses could become distorted when swinging a sword. She added that she trusted him to understand that risk better than anyone. Gray was reminded of his hands before his regression. In his previous life, he had been bullied, and lingering injuries from childhood had permanently hindered his swordsmanship. Professor Heathcote commented that he felt relieved hearing that. Even he admitted that he would hesitate to undergo such training more than once a day. Professor Heathcote dropped a piece of armor, and it crashed heavily into the ground, emphasizing its weight. Gray responded that he understood the concern. One of the professors in white robes then asked why Gray was in such a rush to become stronger when he was already far beyond ordinary students. Professor Ariel stated that the blame lay with her. She explained that she had drawn Gray into a confrontation with Professor Varian, and because of that incident, those working behind Varian now regarded Gray as an enemy. She added that the situation with Radartle was only the beginning. She revealed that there were individuals operating in the shadows of the Academy, possibly even the criminal group Blooddrinker, who had stolen magic catalysts for Varian. Because of that, even isolating Gray in a heavily guarded area would not guarantee his safety. In the end, becoming stronger was the only reliable way for him to survive. She expressed her remorse toward him. Gray responded that it was nothing to feel guilty about, as stopping the Liquidator experiment had been his own decision. He stated that he was determined to put an end to it no matter the cost. She remarked that he was an exceptional student, and that all she could do was help him draw out the full potential of his power. Her words led Professor Heathcote to conclude that she already had a plan in mind. She confirmed that she did. She asked him whether he had forgotten the safest and fastest way for a swordsman to grow stronger. That caused him to look at Gray, who appeared completely confused. Professor Heathcote agreed that replacing the sword was the quickest solution. Gray could not understand their meaning, since the Academy-issued sword was supposed to be a high-grade custom weapon. Professor Ariel explained that it was normally more than sufficient for a first-year student. Unfortunately, it could not endure the power Gray was using. Professor Heathcote agreed with her assessment. She added that no ordinary weapon could withstand that level of force. Because of that, she intended to take Gray to her vault. Professor Heathcote reacted with disbelief, reminding her that she was considering giving a student one of the weapons stored there. She replied calmly that it would be fine. She inserted a key into empty space and turned it, causing light to gather and form a glowing shape. As she stated that Gray had earned the right, it was clear that he was stunned by the sight before him. A rift opened in the air, and she instructed him to follow her. Gray entered last. His eyes widened as soon as he stepped inside. Mountains of gold and countless treasures lay scattered in every direction. They moved through the long corridors toward the sword section. While the two professors continued walking ahead, Gray stood rooted in place, staring around him in silent disbelief. After a moment, he forced himself to follow, and they eventually reached the area where weapons were displayed, intending to find something suitable for him. The moment he arrived, he felt overwhelmed by the sheer number of swords surrounding him. He remarked that no matter where he looked, every single blade radiated danger. Professor Heathcote responded with pride, stating that no sword collection in the world could compare to this one. Professor Ariel understood how overwhelming the choice must be. Ideally, she wanted Gray to test every sword at full strength, but because of the nature of his power, only one sword could be tested per day. In the end, she decided to narrow the selection and have him try a few carefully chosen options, one at a time. She began with the sharpest sword in the vault. Gray commented that it felt unusually heavy in his hands. She agreed, explaining that while it carried significant weight, its cutting ability was exceptional. She produced a thick log for testing. Gray positioned himself, shifting his weight into his grip, raising the sword high before bringing it down in a single strike. The impact cracked the stone floor beneath him. The slash was clean and powerful, splitting the log neatly in half. Gray stared at the result in disbelief. Professor Ariel commented that although the sword possessed tremendous power, it was too heavy to be practical in real combat. Professor Heathcote agreed, adding that even the sharpest blade was useless if Gray could not land a hit. Still, he noted that owning such a weapon would not hurt. Against massive, slow-moving enemies such as divine beasts or even fortified structures, the sword would be extremely effective. Professor Ariel added that she would give Gray a magic storage pouch so he would not need to carry it openly and risk it interfering with his movement, as long as it remained stored. Gray realized immediately that this was not a weapon he could casually lend to others. She stated that it was better than letting the sword sit unused, and she would rather place it in the hands of someone capable. She then posed a question to him. When he had faced Varian, the one responsible for summoning the Liquidator, could he truly claim he would not regret lacking this sword in that moment? The question forced him to pause. He recalled the hopelessness of his previous life, when he believed his existence made no difference no matter how hard he trained. His expression hardened as he sincerely thanked her for entrusting him with the blade. Professor Heathcote then warned him not to reveal the sword to others unless he intended to use it. Gray asked for the reason. Heathcote explained that its market value exceeded 10 billion, no less than 10,000 gold coins. Gray's eyes widened, his jaw nearly dropping. He immediately told Professor Ariel that he could not accept something so valuable, but she calmly replied that she did not accept returns. She clarified that she was not lending the sword, but giving it to him outright. She explained that if it were only borrowed, he would hesitate to use it properly. At first, Gray thought she was joking, but her expression made it clear she was serious. If protecting her divine eye's admission cost only 10 billion, she would gladly pay that price. She said the sword was simply a delayed reward for what he had already accomplished. Gray attempted to protest, but she cut him off, asking whether he truly believed her divine eye's admission was worth less than 10 billion. Intimidated, he quickly answered that it was not. He thanked her again and promised to take good care of the sword. That response finally earned him a satisfied smile. Afterward, she began searching for something more ordinary, a weapon he could depend on during regular battles. Gray admitted that he never imagined her treasury would be this vast. Professor Heathcote responded confidently that it was only natural. After all, no one in the world possessed an eye as sharp as Ariel's divine eye. With it, she could amass as much wealth as she wished. She called Heathcote over and asked which sword he believed would suit Gray best. He scanned the room before pointing out a blade. Gray asked for permission to test it, and she allowed him to proceed. He swung once, then again. He continued chaining strikes together, coordinating them with his footwork. He admitted that the sword was not bad. It was well made, but something about it felt wrong. He wondered if the issue was simply unfamiliarity. Professor Heathcote noticed immediately that the sword did not suit him and moved on to select another. This next blade had been created for experimental purposes, but Heathcote believed it might be a better match. He stopped beside it, and Gray froze the moment he saw it. The sword had a polished silver blade with glowing blue patterns running along its center. It radiated a calm yet razor-sharp presence. Elegant but undeniably powerful, Gray asked what kind of sword it was. Professor Heathcote encouraged him to pick it up. Gray was surprised by how light it felt, though it had no edge at all. Heathcote explained that the sword had been designed for testing new technology rather than combat. It might have lacked sharpness, but its durability was extraordinary. In his opinion, it suited Gray well. Gray asked whether that meant he did not need a sharp blade due to the power he possessed. Heathcote answered that this was exactly the case. He doubted that any sword, regardless of quality, could truly endure Gray's strength indefinitely. If Gray continued to grow stronger, even the weapons in this vault might eventually become nothing more than restraints. If that future awaited him, then a sword that did not rely on an edge might be ideal. Professor Heathcote demonstrated by swinging the sword against a metal log. The log was left dented on every side. Gray stared in shock at the result. Professor Ariel, however, looked unimpressed, knowing Heathcote was simply showing off. She personally believed Gray was still better suited to a proper sword, but she saw no harm in experimentation. She asked if there were any other weapons he wanted to try and even offered to show him different sections if he wished to explore beyond swords. Even so, surrounded by so many blades, Gray only wanted to test more swords. One caught his attention immediately, a blade with a red sheen that looked lighter and stronger than the first. He stated that he wanted to try it and began walking toward it. However, another sword along the path made him stop. A familiar sensation washed over him. He asked Professor Ariel about that blade. She explained that it had been left behind by one of her former students after graduation. It was not famous, but it was exceptionally well crafted. Gray requested permission to test it, and she allowed him. The moment he held it, the sword felt natural, as if it had been made for him. He stepped in front of a training dummy. With almost no visible effort, he sliced it cleanly in half. Both professors were stunned. Gray himself was just as shocked. The sword suited him perfectly. It felt as though he had been wielding it since birth. Professor Ariel asked whether he liked it, and he answered that he did. He admitted that he had never held a sword that felt so effortless to use. She wanted to test it further to confirm its compatibility with his power. Gray hesitated, worried that the sword had once belonged to her student and that he might damage it. She reassured him that there was nothing to fear, confident that the blade would rather be used than left forgotten in storage. That eased his concerns. Curious, he asked for the name of the alumnus who had forged it. She replied that it was Metallum Norum. Gray froze. Metallum Norum was the greatest magic swordsmith in the world, and the blade in his hand had been forged by him. They moved to the training grounds to test the weapons properly. To assess both strength and durability, Professor Ariel instructed Gray to push the blades to their limits. They began with the sword marked by blue patterns. They chose the most unconventional sword first to observe how it interacted with his power. Gray stood at the center of the field, surrounded by training dummies, and began channeling his energy. A red aura formed around his body, but then it abruptly dispersed. He froze in shock and said that he would try again. Slowly, the sword became coated in red light. He focused, attempting to merge himself with the blade and pour his power into it. Once again, the energy scattered. A trace of panic appeared on his face as he realized his power was not activating at all. Professor Ariel approached and asked whether he felt any changes in his physical condition. He replied that he felt no difference. She suspected the sword itself was the issue. Deciding not to force the matter, she set it aside and prepared to test another weapon. She concluded that the blade simply did not resonate with his power. If that was the case, then the best option was the most ordinary sword of all. She reached into her magic pouch and withdrew the blade forged by Norum. Gray stands by himself beneath the bright sky, ringed by rows of armored training dummies, with the sword resting at his side as he gathers his resolve to begin. He closes his fingers around the hilt, then declares that he is a single blade, while a dark mist clings to the steel and twists into a violent red aura that creeps up his arm and spills around his entire body. He senses the change at once and tells himself that he activated it, but his red eyes widen as a different thought slices into his mind, saying that while there is time, he jerks and blurts that what? He wonders if he just heard a voice inside his head, while the unseen presence continues, saying that when the time comes. The interruption leaves him still for a heartbeat, and only an uncertain sound lingers in him like a question he cannot answer. From a distance, Professor Heathcote stands beside Professor Ariel, and he says that triggering his power should not be a problem with that sword. At the center of the field, Gray lowers his stance and says that here he goes. He bursts forward. The first swing rips out with a heavy slash, and crimson lines carve through the air toward the nearest dummy. He thinks that the gripping is the same as before, but because the blade glides with an unnatural ease, the motion blurs into something smooth and relentless. It swings insanely smooth. His joints loosen as if weight has been peeled away from his limbs, and he exclaims to himself that his body feels light. Armor plates explode apart under the red arcs, and chunks of metal and shattered debris kick up as the sword passes. Gray darts through the formation so fast that his strikes overlap, the red trails crossing like a cage around him. On the sidelines, robed onlookers stare hard. One gasps that he is fast, and another admits that he is different from last time. Gray surges again, and his inner voice confesses that it feels like he is flying. A helmet tumbles away and bounces across the ground. Gray skids to a stop amid the wreckage, breathing hard. He pants out, then mutters a confused exclamation. He scans the field as he notices that there are no more targets. His gaze tightens as he thinks that the number of targets is the same as before. He remembers that he could only cut about half of them back then, yet now he recognizes with stunned disbelief that he wiped them all out. From behind, Professor Ariel calls his name Gray. She demands to know how he is still standing. Her face twists with alarm, and she screams that he should drop the sword. The weapon slips free and clatters away as Gray's body folds. He chokes out a pained gaw while dropping to one knee. At once Ariel shouts to cast healing magic, and green light surges over him as the group rushes in. Gray lurches forward while the fading healing glow still clings to his skin, and he lets out a strangled groan, as his knees threaten to give out completely. His palm slaps the ground as he forces himself upright, and he gasps. His breath tears in and out, and through the haze he thinks that his strength is, even as his fingers tremble uncontrollably. Professor Heathcote moves in fast and hooks an arm around Gray to keep him from collapsing, and he warns him that he should not push himself. Gray still sags against him, shaking, and he apologizes. Nearby, Professor Ariel watches the blood on Gray and speaks sharply, saying that losing that much blood will drain his stamina even with healing magic, and she tells him that he should rest for a while. As Gray leans there, Heathcote adds that he broke past a limit he could not before. That is a good sign, he guesses. Professor Ariel continues in a lower, firmer tone, saying that moving without realizing his own condition is dangerous too, and Gray acknowledges that is true. She adds that in actual combat without a dedicated healer, he had better be careful. She turns the sword in her hands and studies it under the sunlight. Even after everything, she notes that there is not a single scratch, and she states that it really is an incredible sword. For a moment she falls silent, staring at the blade's surface, then she wonders if the sword's glow got a little stronger, before doubting herself and thinking that it might just be her imagination. The blade catches the sky in its reflection. Her expression snaps tight as something distant shifts, and she stiffens hard enough that the others notice. One of them asks what is wrong, Professor. A violent blast erupts from the Academy's direction, and a blooming cloud of crimson and black smoke pours upward as the tower trembles. Shock ripples across the grounds. Voices rise as people scream that it is an explosion and shout to run because debris is coming down. Orders crash over the panic as someone commands that all instructors cast barrier magic, and another voice insists that they prioritize protecting lives. Gray stares, stunned, and he can only wonder what happened. Professor Heathcote's face hardens as he looks toward the smoke, and he says that that area houses the hazardous materials vault. He states that it was clearly a man-made explosion. He continues that right after the blast, he saw something like teleportation magic for a split second, and he wonders if they openly robbed the Academy HQ. Others immediately protest, insisting that it is impossible, because the vault walls are protected by powerful anti-teleportation and are built to withstand most explosive spells too. Professor Ariel keeps watching the tainted smoke, and she says that there was Liquidator energy mixed into it. She reasons that they probably used crystals made in the Underworld lab to destroy the outer wall and the anti-teleportation sphere. Gray's eyes widen as the implication lands, and he realizes aloud that the one who caused that explosion was Varian's allies. A sick certainty settles in him as he recognizes that they actually made a move against the Academy HQ.